Hello, I'm Eric Toder of the Tax Policy Center. Thank you for joining us for the 12th Annual IRS TPC Joint Research Conference on Tax Administration. This year's event is especially timely given the continued concern about inadequate funding of the IRS, which makes the new research presented at this conference on how to improve the efficiency of IRS enforcement and taxpayer services especially salient. We have a really outstanding program today, reflecting insightful new research on measuring and improving tax compliance, reducing taxpayer burden, and applying new technologies to tax enforcement. And we are delighted to have as our luncheon speaker, John Aboud, the U.S. Census Bureau's Associate Director for Research and Methodology, and one of the country's leading experts on how to reconcile improving the data available for statistical analysis with privacy concerns. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. Today's event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterwards. You may hide captions or adjust settings with a live transcript button. The slides, speaker biographies, and abstracts are all available at taxpolicycenter.org. All participants are muted. Please type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time during the sessions. We will get to them during the Q&A period at the end of each session. Finally, please complete the survey at the end of the event. I would now like to introduce Melanie Kraus, who joined the IRS as Chief Analytics Officer of the Research Applied Analytics and Statistics Division in October 2021. In this role, Dr. Kraus coordinates research activities to advance areas of strategic importance to the IRS. Prior to joining the IRS, she served as Assistant Inspector General for Management and Administration with the Department of Veteran Affairs Office of Inspector General. We are delighted to co-sponsor this event with IRS, and I look forward to your remarks, Melanie. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric. So I am really excited to be able to join you to launch this 12th annual Joint IRS Tax Policy Center Research Conference. Like you mentioned, we really do have a very full and impressive agenda for today's meeting. But before I turn to the official program, I wanted to cover two topics. So first, I want to supplement some of the details that you already shared about me and my background. I do think that it's important that in this community, we begin to get to know each other better, and that will serve as an important foundation for our future collaboration. Second, I also want to share some of my observations since joining the IRS and why these research partnerships are so important for us. So like Eric mentioned, I joined in October of 2021. I did not grow up in tax, so to speak. So rather, my career began in the early 2000s in healthcare. I worked initially as a nursing assistant and then later as a registered nurse providing bedside care. I pursued a PhD not because I didn't enjoy patient care, but because of my love for data and policy. From 2009 to mid-2017, I worked in government oversight, initially with the Government Accountability Office, and then later, as Eric mentioned, with the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. For the 4 years leading up to my transition to the IRS, my portfolio involved overseeing the operations and administrative aspects for my agency. So information technology, data services, budget formulation, and execution, other administrative functions. At my core, I thrive on change and new challenges, and hopefully that will add to our collaborations in the future. My first introduction to tax was when I began volunteering as a tax preparer at a VITA site in my community. I learned a lot through my years as a tax preparer, and for me, that experience was as much about learning to navigate a 1040 as developing empathy for the challenging financial situations that many of our neighbors experience. It also gave me additional insight into some of the barriers that some taxpayers experience when trying to maintain voluntary compliance. I also have personal experience with real estate investments and partnerships, though other areas of tax, particularly in the international space, are still new for me. I hope that since this format this year isn't conducive to having a conversation, that those on this conference will reach out to me. I'm active on LinkedIn. Let's get to know one another. All right, so enough about me. Let's shift gears to the importance of our research partnerships. Transitioning to the IRS has been even more fun than I expected because the challenges we are facing in tax are really complex. So just to name a few, how can we leverage data to anticipate the revenue impact of emerging areas of noncompliance? Can we leverage operational audit data for other purposes, such as tax gap estimation? How can we modify or simplify our forms and guidance to taxpayers to best improve voluntary compliance? And then importantly, how can we make more tax data available outside of the IRS to facilitate evidence building while still adhering to 6103 requirements? Barry Johnson and I met with Commissioner Rettig a few weeks ago to discuss a research paper, which is something that we will commonly do with him. And the conversation concluded with the commissioner offering his appreciation for the quote, big brains who we were working with. And it is honestly a direct quote. In this case, the big brains were from an academic institution that I won't name here. I share this to make the point that at the highest levels of the service, there is a clear understanding that research and our research partnerships have a big impact. I want to describe a couple of the benefits as I see them. Credibility. For example, we are actively working through a redesign of our national research program that would leverage advanced analytic techniques in an active learning framework. So while there are individuals and groups who wonder what took us so long to get to this point, there are other very thoughtful people who raise concerns about whether leveraging risk-based audits for this purpose would yield biased results. So our external partnerships and peer review processes are essential. They're essential for ensuring that our approach is sound, and it also gives us some protection because we can document how we have collaborated with outside experts to develop, refine, and test our approach. Our partnerships also yield access to resources. So yesterday I hosted a new employee orientation for our team in RAS. Most of the people in that orientation were students with representation from Harvard, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon University, as well as local institutions. The energy was contagious. And this is a really important supplement to the talent that we're able to recruit to join the government formally. This is also important for recruitment. So in full transparency, I'm plotting to keep all of those students on board in the IRS. And this really is an important strategy for being able to bring people in the door who might not have otherwise considered federal service. This work is important for retention. Our research partnerships aid us in making diverse opportunities available to our staff. So, without question, there is work that we need to undertake that pays the bills that might not be quite as intellectually stimulating. Having these partnerships yields opportunities to continue to learn new analytic techniques, build evidence in areas that we personally care about, and much, much more. And then we're also working on issues that are big issues for society that really go outside of tax. The work with Urban on developing synthetic tax data sets gives me goosebumps. When I was at the NTA spring conference, I ran into Len and he confessed that work is keeping him partially out of retirement. I mean, how exciting to have partners that are so committed to this important work that they forego retirement to be able to continue to collaborate with us. It's really very exciting. So as we turn to the formal program for today, I want to thank everybody for making this possible. For our event organizers, thank you. Our panelists, I know that you have put a lot into preparing for your presentations today. And for everyone else who is joining as participants, thank you. Your engagement is appreciated and important. And so without further ado, Aaron, I think I'm turning it to you.
Thanks, Melanie. My name is Aaron Catch. I'm a researcher and technical project manager at IRS RAS, and welcome to session 1, balancing audits, enforcement versus measuring non-compliance. In this session, we'll have 3 presenters given 20 minutes each to present their research. Up first, we'll have Alex Turk, a researcher and senior manager at IRS RAS. Alex, you'll turn it over to Lou Rizzo, who's a researcher at WeStat, who will go next. And then Lou, we'll turn it over to Peter Henderson, a researcher at Stanford University. At the end of that time, we'll have a discussion with Alan Plumley, a researcher and technical advisor at IRS RAS. And then we hope to have some questions and answers, which you can use the question and answer box. I'll try to monitor those things. And then after the discussion, we'll have, I'll try to present those to the panel. Without further ado, Alex, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Assuming you can see the slides. So this is joint work with Shani Roy, Brett Collins, and Mark Payne. Unfortunately, Shani is out of the country. Otherwise, she'd probably be presenting this. But so what we're looking at here is how do we combine audit data from the NRP program with operational audit data to develop models of underreporting. So, and since Melanie is from the medical community, we decided to choose a title that just basically takes part of the methodology and sticks it in the title, like you see in so many medical papers, rather than, you know, economists sometimes get catchy titles that are, you know, eye-grabbing versus. So that's just we're just trying to, you know, kowtow to what Melanie would like. That's obviously a joke. Perhaps not that well received, but so standard disclaimer, these are our views, not necessarily those of the IRS. So let's see. Went the wrong way. Okay, so real quick, just a little bit about the NRP program, their National Research Program data. If you're not familiar with it, so it's a representative sample of individual tax returns, and it was a replacement for the Taxpayer Compliance Measurement Program that kicked off in 2000. NRP kicked off in 2001, and there have been annual samples under the NRP program since 2006, whereas the old TCMP was more of a periodic, very large sample that happened every so often. The NRP now is a rolling sample of audits each year. But there's been some reductions in the audits recently, just due to various resource constraints at the IRS, you know, and the increased opportunity cost of running the National Research Program. These audits are primarily conducted in the field in the office by revenue agents and tax compliance officers. So what we'll do is we'll focus on operational audits, which are covered by the same set of employees. So part of the motivation is, you know, as we look to redesign this, one of the recommendations was to make fuller use of operational audits or these risk-based audits in modeling underreporting and ultimately perhaps, you know, measuring compliance. But this brings up issues, right, about potential bias. One is you know, because these audits are not, op audits are not selected at random, there's a potential for selection bias in that. So somehow you have to account for that. And then there are also measurement error, can be measurement differences in terms of the operational audit versus the NRP audit, because there are various different types of operational audits, and you'll see audits close in the data that came from various sources and for various reasons. Whereas the NRP program, there's a little tighter control on the classification process and all that stuff. But this has been attempted before, at least in terms of looking at operational audits and sorts. Previous work by Brian Arard and Chi-Chin Ho back in 2002. I think we actually presented at this conference, looked at operational audits. But that all obviously predated having the National Research Program data. Okay, so the National NRP, where we're at today, really provides us a unique opportunity to explore these bias controls in parametric models using data from this when we add data from these non-probability samples. It kind of gives us this out of sample ground truth data that we can use to evaluate our methodology. And it's also very important, or very useful in evaluating, active learning approaches, which you'll hear more about today. Typically when econometricians try to do these sorts of models with selection bias controls, et cetera, they kind of do the analysis and then hope for the best, because you don't have this data sitting there. So what we're going to do is focus on comparing the model's ability to estimate tax misreporting, what we'll call predictive tax change, and the probability that the auditor determines the taxpayer is fully compliant or fully reported their tax liability, or what's commonly referred to as no change. And how does that change? How does our estimate change when we start adding non-random data from these operational audits to the model training? And we're going to focus for this paper only on returns with earned income tax, the earned income tax credit. Okay. So we're going to focus on this across the risk distribution. That is, we're going to look, not the high risk versus lower risk taxpayers. It's not enough just to estimate the overall average. If I can do that, the overall expectation, I can get the total if I know the total population size. But to be useful for tax administration, we have to accurately assess risk across the distribution to ensure that we're applying resources fairly and all those sorts of things. So in doing that, the expected audit adjustment and the percentage of no change are key features in the compliance distribution of observed, when you observe reporting compliance. Even as far back, almost 40 years ago, Clotfelter's already stat paper was one of the first to account for that and use a Tobit model to account for the huge mass of taxpayers you see fully complying with tax liability, their liability. And this can come from two different sources. One, taxpayers may be just fully reporting their liability, or it could be some measurement error in the data. However, a lot of the research and even in the lab experiments suggests that fully reporting your liability is a common outcome of our behavioral response that's legitimate in the data. Okay, so our general approach is we're going to pool the operational and the NRP audit data together. And estimate and look at how that impacts any under-reporting model. So to do that, we need to have some way to control for this potential selection bias. So we've developed a probit model to model the probability that an operational case is audited. And once we have that, we can use that in our under-reporting model. So important thing is we are only going to use audits from field and office, and because those are most similar to the NRP audits, they use the same set of labor resources. Some of the other research you'll see today will also include the correspondence audits. Okay, so once we have our Heckman style selection bias control, we pool the 2014 10 to 14 NRP data with the 2010 to 14 field and office operational data, and then you look at how that impacts a model of tax underreporting. Now, to do that, we have to figure out how do we combine these, and we basically do it in the most naive way or ad hoc way possible. We just simply combine them. We throw the cases together. However, the NRP cases are a stratified random sample, so if you want unconditional estimates of, let's say, the mean, et cetera, you really need to consider the weight, the expansion weights, or the weights that are on from that sample. So to do that, we basically normalize the weights from the NRP data by the average weight, so that on average, an NRP case is weighted as 1. The operational cases are weighted to 1. So if you sum up the weights, you basically get the sample size. And then we're going to estimate a two-step parametric switching model to model both the probability of categorical outcomes in terms of no change versus positive change or negative change, and then conditional regression models of the amount of change conditional on, say, a positive change, for example. Okay, so we're going to include a Heckman style correction fact selection bias control, and then a dummy for whether it's an operational versus a NRP audit. And we're going to use the model we estimate to come up with and back out these operational potential biases to come up with an NRP measured predicted tax change and predicted probability of no change. All right, so just the math, or the math behind that, we have our standard audit probate model to create this inverse Mills ratio or Heckman selection factor lambda. And then we have a multinomial logit where we're estimating the probability of each of these categorical outcomes of negative tax change, no change or low change, and high tax change based on a set of factors X, and then our dummy for an operational audit and our selection bias control. And then for example, taking the positive, the high tax change, we run a second stage regression of those two cases on another set of X's and those operational selection bias sorts of controls. So what we're really after are the gamma J's and the alpha J's here to come up with a predicted tax change, which is basically combining the expected tax change conditional that's positive times the probability that's positive plus the expected tax change conditional that's negative times the probability that's negative, and so on and so forth. Basically setting those D and the dummy and lambda to 0 in the prediction equation. Okay, so like I said, we focus on EITC returns, and these are in our nomenclature, activity codes 270 and 271, and you'll see some of this in some of the other papers as well. But 270 is basically the big group of EITC returns. They can have a Schedule C, but it has under 24,000 or 25,000 in gross receipts. 271 is a much smaller set of returns, but they have if they have a Schedule C, it's more than $25,000 in gross receipts. So everything we do are going to focus on these two activity codes. Okay, so top table here, just a little description of the population. For 270, there's almost 23.5 million taxpayers who were in this activity code for tax year 19. And the 270 group has a fairly robust sample from in the historical NRP. We have about 12,000 NRP cases and about 112,000 op cases. And we have quite kind of the opposite for 271. It's a smaller population of about 2 million, but we have less than 1,000 cases in the NRP in those five years, and about 52,000 op cases. So dramatically much more op cases relative to NRP cases for 271 than at 270. So what we'll show you is basically comparing the actual observed predicted tax change to the predicted tax change when we use both NRP and operational data to the predicted tax change when we use NRP only. So you can see for 270, 271, we were in the ballpark in terms of predicted tax change and very close in terms of no change rate, and fairly similar across the two groups. What we really want to do is dive into the distribution, across the distribution. So the way I'll show that is what we do is we take our 2015 evaluation set. So this is the NRP cases in tax year 2015, and we rank them based on the NRP only model by the no change rate or by the predicted tax change. And this graph is showing you by the no change rate. And we split it into basically 5 percentile bins and calculate the average tax change, the average no change, or the no change rate, the average predicted no change rate, and with the NRP only model, and then the average predicted no change rate with the model that uses both NRP and operational cases. So you can see the NRP only model does track the no change rate fairly well, with the lowest risk cases to the highest risk cases. And when we add the op cases, looks like we're getting some bias in those highest risk cases. We're overstating the no change rate. So what we do, so we have an option there is we can, because it's a two-step model, we can say, well, do we want to use those cases in in the second stage, in the first stage and the second stage. So what I'm showing you here is basically on the left, we use the op cases in both the first stage probability model and the second stage regression models, and then compare the results based on predicted tax change. So you can see the NRP only model tracks the tax change fairly closely on the training set, but we underestimate the tax change at the top of the distribution. And that's on the left. Now, in the right, if we exclude the op cases from the first stage regression, but include them in the second stage regression, we almost get the same result. I mean, the predictions. So that's evidence that we're able to account for the potential bias that could come from adding those cases to the mix. We also did some simulations where we say, okay, what if we have less NRP data? How would this change? And what we typically find is, especially at the top of the risk distribution, we start to get more variability, but it doesn't change a lot with 270 simply because we have that robust training data set. And same with the predicted tax change. Okay, so I want to switch over to the 271, which is, remember, a case where we have less than 1,000 returns to estimate a model with the NRP data in our sample. Okay, so this is the probability of no change, but again, ranked based on the NRP only no change probability model. And then we can plot the predicted no change when we add the operational cases to the training data set. And you can see we again have a potential bias in that estimation, in that predicted no change rate. So, and it gets worse if we start reducing the number of NRP training cases available. Now, this does bounce around a lot because even the test data set, the evaluation data set for 2015 is a very small data set. So you break that into 5 percentile ranges, you get very small sample size. So that's why the actual bounces around quite a bit. So this is the expected predicted tax change, both with just the NRP training model and then adding the operational cases only to the second stage. So I'm not showing you the model when we allow the op cases into the first stage logit regression. Okay, so you can see they track pretty closely, and obviously this is a small data set, but you can see some of the peaks in the actual are actually corresponding to some peaks in the NRP plus op model. So there may be gains to adding that data to the second stage regression. Again, this is ranked by the NRP only model. So you have to rank by one model if you want to put all these lines on the same chart. And it gets worse if we start doing the simulation where we start reducing the amount of NRP training data we have available. Stuff starts to bounce around, but having the op data helps kind of stabilize that, because of the sheer the number of cases that are available. Okay, and this has been somewhat surprising because our intuition is that you add these cases to the mix and the op cases are just going to overwhelm the NRP cases because of the sheer sample size differences. But that doesn't happen, at least not to the degree I expected it to. So I think that's some evidence that we may be on the right track. Okay, so just to sum up here, so one thing we found is we have to be careful when we're training models using operational data, especially on the models of the probability of adjustment, the no change rate on that extensive margin. These simple bias controls may not be sufficient, and this really does reinforce the need for representative and consistently labeled data like we have in the NRP. And just to highlight, I didn't present it here, but we have done some where we fully train on only operational data. And I think the technical term is it kind of goes off the rails. And you'll see that the need for random representative data in a couple of the other papers you'll see today. But when we restrict the categorical model to only NRP, we're able to account for a lot of this bias And the simple bias controls seem to be working fairly well when we model that conditional audit adjustment, that intensive margin. So there's a lot of different approaches, enhancements we've been considering. The way we weight the NRP versus the operational is very ad hoc. We've looked at other ways, of balancing the weights, but more rigorous approaches to weighting those operational cases versus NRP cases, especially the operational cases where we think there's a higher quality of the label the tax change, and then to better account for compliance cases that are screened out of the operational audit pipeline, because as cases make their way to being assigned, there's a classification process, and some of them get screened out, and those could be used as soft labels of potential no change and things like that. So there's clearly more work to be done there. So I'll turn it over. That's it. I'll turn it over to Lou to talk about his paper, and look forward to comments and questions.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Lou Rizzo from Westat. I'm working with Roz. Kim Henry is our primary contact. We've also worked with John Guyton, Alex, and Drew Johns. Our team includes Richard Valiant, our technical advisor, emeritus professor of University of Michigan, and our Westat team, John Riddles and Xiaoshu Ju. Okay, I won't, Alex has already gone through some of the background information about the NRP, so I won't stress that. We're sort of covering the same ground as Alex's team, but with a different perspective. We're coming at this from a statistical theory, sampling statistics theory viewpoint, rather than an econometrician's viewpoint. So we've come up with some different methods, different procedures to provide a large set of possible approaches that IRS can use. We worked with the 2015 National Research Program. That's 2013 through 2015. We work with a full range of 145 million tax returns. The sample size, the NRP sample size for 2015 was 13,742. The mean tax change, the weighted estimate, is 1217. That includes no change and negative tax change. The sum of the NRP weights add to the full set of returns, 145 million, and the overall estimate of tax change in 2015 is from NRP alone is $176 billion. As previous speakers have already pointed out, in recent years, budget constraints for IRS have resulted in a reduction of NRP sample sizes. So dealing with the same problems, we also looked into adding the operational audits. The counts for the operational audits are very large, many times that NRP, as Alex pointed out. In 2015, there were 800,000 operational audits, about 0.6% of all returns, compared to 13,700 NRP. Now, from the viewpoint of NRP, these audits are free. They are available and paid for from routine compliance work and only need to be processed for NRP research. But as Alex had pointed out, they suffer from selection bias. They are not chosen randomly. So for 2015, the overall NRP tax change mean was 1217. The overall OP, if you take the 800,000 Operational audits take the mean value of tax change as 3315, which is almost 3 times larger. So that's evidence of the selection bias. If you look at the percentage, the weighted percentage of negative or zero tax change returns from the NRP weighted sample is about 52%. For the operational returns, it's 44%. So it's you can see that the operational is getting more of the positive tax change than the NRP. So there is evidence of selection bias. And here's a graph showing that the operational for the 13 major strata, activity strata, the OP tends to be on the high side compared to NRP. Now, our approach was similar to Alex's team. We set about to estimate a propensity to be an operational audit. Our predictor matrix was all the self-reported information from the returns themselves. We used, instead of a probit model, we used a machine learning propensity estimation procedure using C-force, which is a version of random forest. The mean value of these propensities is 0.6%, which is 800,000 divided by 145 million. But the range of propensities, we have a low of 0.004% in activity stratum 272, up to a high of 23.1%. So there was one audit that was evaluated by the model as having an almost 1/4 chance of being operationally audited. So we have a wide range of propensities coming out of the C-force machine learning framework. Using these estimated propensities, we developed at least 4 estimators. There's a very conservative estimator that we developed, which is essentially the NRP weighted estimator. But we add in all of the operational audits as self-representing. They come in as representing themselves only. They come in with a weight of 1, whereas the NRP have their sample weight. But to avoid double counting between the NRP and the OP returns coming in, we bring the NRP returns in with their NRP weight multiplied by 1 minus the estimated propensity of the NRP return being operational. 1 minus that propensity. The WHI is the NRP sample weight, pi is the propensity. So the final estimator is the unweighted OP tax change, plus the NRP with this adjustment. Usually the share of the OP is very small. So in this approach, it will account for 1, 2, 3% only of the weighted estimator, the equivalent of 100, 200, 300 NRP units with their full weights. So there's only a small reduction in standard error. But the assumptions are very limited. So the risk of bias is also very low. With this estimator. This shows you this is for positive only. This shows you, this is a comparison of the simple weighted NRP mean with this adjustment. So that you can see in most cases that the difference between the 2 estimates is not very large. But there is some improvements. And some gain. This presents this is the OP weighted mean, the OP by itself, the blue dots. The NRP is a 45-degree line, and you can see that this auxiliary estimator runs very close to the NRP. It's very conservative. Now, we also had 2 different kinds of composite estimators. if we can assure ourselves that the OP estimator is unbiased within a particular NRP stratum, the tax return domain being use of H, then we can use a composite estimator. We take a linear combination of the weighted NRP, of the mean of the operational, a linear combination. Alpha sub H will be based on the relative size of the variances of the two estimators. Just a straightforward composite estimation theory. We were very strict. We required that the two distributions, not just the mean values, but the two distributions be matching in order to justify the unbiasedness of the OP. We needed to be convinced that there was no evidence of selection bias, and we did get that in the case of some of the a small subset of the NRP substratum. And we had a second composite. If the OP is not unbiased for the full stratum domain U sub H, but the OP units are unbiased over a partial stratum domain A sub H, then we can composite over that equated domain A sub H. We put together the NRP estimate for this domain A sub H, the OP estimate, and we can composite to over A sub H and have an unbiased estimate. And then we for the complement domain, we just use the NRP. And we created our team created these partial stratum domains using DIF. DIF is it comes out of an operational machine learning system for defining returns that may need to be audited. Using that DIF, in some cases, we can define a unbiased partial stratum domain. Another much less conservative estimator, as it explicitly allows for bias, is the sliding scale estimator. The form of this estimator is the same. It's a composite estimator for each NRP stratum. For the NRP and the mean of the operational audits, tax change. In this case, we do not require the operational estimator to be unbiased. We do this for all strata. But what we do is we measure the bias of the squared bias of the operational estimator, and then alpha sub H is inversely proportional to the relative size of the estimated mean squared error of the two estimators. The NRP has no bias. So it's, the mean squared error is just a variance. And for the operational, we have squared bias and variance together. So this each of these columns represent NRP substrata. 100% represents all NRP. 0% represents all OP. So this is an evaluation for each estimator. What percentage is NRP? What percentage is OP? The one full, these are substrata for which we could do full composition. The OP was judged to be unbiased. These substrata, two partial, represent represent those we could do the partial composition, and then 3 represents we could do neither full nor partial. So in the case of 3, we only had the auxiliary, OP auxiliary, the sliding scale, and the NRP. So for the one full, these triangles represent the composite estimator, which is strongly towards the OP, since the OP has a much larger sample size. For the two partial, these stars represent the composite estimator. And there's a strong element for OP, but about 25%, but they're just about 75%, except in these two cases, NRP. So it's still relatively conservative. And then in the no case, these blue squares are the OP auxiliary, which is very close to the NRP, is very conservative. And these red dots are the sliding scale, which depending on the squared bias can be strongly towards the OP, or if that bias is larger, then they fall back towards NRP. And these are the actual average tax change estimates for the various competitors. And here we compare the NRP, the OP self-representing, the sliding scale, and then a hybrid, which is either the full composite, the partial composite, or where we could do no equating, just the NRP estimate itself. So we have four different estimators. In general, they're fairly close in both means and standard error, but there are potential improvements from the simple weighted NRP. And this is a graph. The blue dots are the OP weighted mean. If we just use OP completely, which we know is upwardly biased, the 45-degree line represents the NRP, and the estimates are mostly around that line. But with a sliding scale, there can be larger differences, but there's a greater risk of bias. So in conclusion, I think the primary conclusion is the last one. As with Alex's work, these alternatives show that there is a way forward for IRS to incorporate operational audits into the National Research Program, but it must be done very judiciously, very, very carefully to avoid the possibility of, as Alex said, the possibility of running off the rails, of ending up with sizable biases. Okay, thank you for participating in our presentation. Our emails are lourizzo@westat.com and Kimberly A. Henry at irs.com. We thank you for your attention. I will pass it back to Aaron for the next speaker.
Thanks, Lou. Actually, we'll be having our final session presenter. Looks like Peter, you're ready?
Yep. Thanks all for listening. I'm going to be talking about integrating reward maximization and population estimation, sequential decision-making for IRS audit selection. So this is sort of the active learning that was referenced by Alex earlier on. This is work with wonderful co-authors, Ben Chug, Brandon Anderson, Kristen Altenberger, Alex Turk, John Guyton, Jacob Golden, and Danielle Ho. This is a mix of IRS RAS and Stanford folks, and all the views expressed here are my own and not the co-authors or IRS or any other company or government entity. So there's been a fair amount of discussion on how the proportion of audits and the budget allocation is quite low, And obviously you'd like to do more audits and allocate more resources to auditing. But it's actually, I think one of the previous presenters also mentioned it's about 0.5% in 2018. It hovers around this amount of audits. So that means that you have to think about how to allocate resources to this 0.5% really well. And I won't belabor the NRP, which has been presented several times now, but you have your random sample, which is NRP. You have your risk model, which is DIF, and that generates your op audits. And then, so this is to, select for finding misreporting, but you also have to have good estimates. And the previous two presentations talked about how to combine in op with NRP to get really good estimates. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about how do we make selection in this process in a way that you can combine both processes and think and optimize for these two objectives directly. And so this brings us to sequential decision making, which is a very popular topic in machine learning research right now. And basically what this is you have an agent. The agent takes some action to interact with your environment. The agent gets back some reward for how well they did in their selection, and then they get the next state. Internally within the agent, there's also a reward prediction model, which is a lot like your op audit selection mechanism, or the risk selection mechanism that we talked about before. So this is used by a lot of companies right now. So for example, Netflix, you may have heard, uses something a lot like this to figure out which cover art to show you to try to get you to watch new content that they have. So in this case, you have a context, which is the user and sort of their click history. You have a set of movie banners that they might want to show you. And then the reward that the agent gets is how much did the person really watch the content that you presented to them. And you're trying to identify a policy that gets people to watch things or recommends things that people want to actually watch. So you want to, using the terminology of sort of the field, you want to explore new movies and preferences to make sure that you have a good range of understanding about what the users actually like. And then you want to exploit those preferences to get back reward. This is like very much terminology of the field, so I'll just present it here. But in this case, we have IRS, right? And so it's really an optimization problem. And we're trying to explore to make sure that we really have a good understanding of the tax gap, of where misreporting is happening. But you also want to make sure that you are actively finding the largest amounts of misreporting to close, what's a fairly large tax gap. And so, but unlike the Netflix case and typical research in machine learning, we also have requirements of unbiased population statistics. So that's the tax gap, average misreporting, maybe substrata that you might want to know more about, like the EITC. And these requirements, there's not a whole lot of research on how to do this dual objective problem in the machine learning literature. So there's a tempting, first pass solution that machine learning folks might want to do, which is you take like a regression-based risk model, maybe a random forest regressor or a neural net or something like that. You want to do selection and then just use your model to also do estimation. So it's a purely model-based estimate. And you don't do random sampling at all. But there's a lot of problems with not doing random sampling and with using model-based selection. So first, there's no theoretically guaranteed ways to remove bias in the low sample regime. As of yet, maybe that will change. But you can't remove bias from these models because they're nonlinear. Maybe we'll see something like that soon. You can reduce the bias though, but there's no guarantees on that. And so that's not really ideal. And also, if you don't do any random sampling, that lack of exploration can lead to suboptimal feedback loops And so your model can get stuck in a state where it's like oversampling a particular area, and that can lead to significant problems. So what do we look at? Well, we started to look at combining the machine learning literature that's pretty extensive. The algorithms that are in this literature that we looked at are called bandit algorithms. And so they optimize for the reward only. And then we want to combine in the sampling literature that allows us to get that unbiased population estimation. And so we call this optimize and estimate structured bandits. It's a very like machine learning-y name, since that's a majority of the author's field, though we have a pretty interdisciplinary team. So yeah, so then we create an algorithm within this new framework where we have this dual objective problem of estimating misreporting and optimizing for identifying the biggest amounts of misreporting. So you might imagine you have like a risk distribution fit with a random forest regressor, which looks something like this, right? Now, again, it might be tempting to just take the top part of this distribution only. That's where you're going to see the most revenue, the most reward. But again, this is going to lead to a biased model, a biased estimate, and feedback loops, potentially. And so this is what we would call greedy selection. On the other side of things, you could have totally random selection. And this is going to give you that unbiased estimate. It's going to be pretty low variance if you take enough samples, but it's going to give you suboptimal and low reward. So what you really want is you want something in between. You want to combine something like a logit with this distribution and give you fine-grained control over how much you're going to follow this risk distribution and sampling this PDF, basically. And so what we do is we actually mix it with either an exponential or a logit logistic function, and we can vary the amount of mixing to adjust how much we're following this risk distribution, and therefore sort of map between fully random and risk-based selection in a way that is pushing things toward the top part of the risk distribution, but retains unbiased estimates. And we can retain those unbiased estimates through a Horvitz-Thompson sampling approach. So because we know the exact probability distribution, because we've selected beforehand according to this mapping across the risk space, we can get fine-grained control over reward pushing toward that top part of the distribution, or variance by pushing down. And the Horvitz-Thompson estimator basically reweights, just sort of a little bit like what you saw earlier. It reweights samples by the probability of that return being selected for auditing. And this gives us unbiasedness and gives us fine-grained control over that reward variance trade-off. And so to test this out, what we do is we create the simulated environment where we take NRP 2006 to 2014. For every year, we take an 80% subsample. This gives us a bootstrap estimate so we can get confidence intervals over our simulations. We give the policy 500 covariates from the tax returns. And then in the bandit literature, every option that you have to take is called an arm. So we select a budget of K arms. We simulate a 1-year gap, and then we return the tax adjustment after that gap. So that's your reward for the agent, and the agent then makes a population estimate, right? So it's kind of what you would expect in the sequential decision-making problem. And then we repeat this year over year, and then you get like a time series of how the agent behaved year over year. And what we see is for unbiased methods, which is this ABS approach, and also random sampling, and if you take sort of an epsilon greedy approach, what we see is for the epsilon greedy, which is a 10% random sample, and then the rest is greedy. This, you might think of this as sort of like a 10% NRP with an op, but it's really, a very rough approximation of that. This is more of a baseline in the machine learning literature that's very common. What you see is that will give you, similar reward, or ABS will give you similar reward to that approach, but it reduces variance quite a bit, and it retains unbiasedness. And then your fully random sample, if you just took the whole budget and allocated that to random sampling, you get very, very low reward. You lose out on a lot of reward, but you get unbiasedness and the lowest variance, but a very high no change rate. But with smart selection, by adjusting this ABS risk curve and sampling in this way and using the Horowitz-Thompson estimator, we can reduce the variance, we can reduce the no change rate, and we can keep that reward, and we get an unbiased population estimate. Now, if you compare against biased methods, which is that model-based selection I talked about, you'll get much lower variance, but you have very high bias, right? So in many cases, this is really not what you want, because that biased estimation has no guarantees on which way the bias is going. You don't know how big that bias is going to be. So you have no guarantees there. Surprisingly, fully greedy selection works actually pretty well in terms of just the reward. And that is actually potentially an artifact of the low sample regime that we're testing in with the NRP samples. What's happening is with the low sample regime with high stochasticity in the features, there was a proof earlier this year from some folks that showed this is like provably efficient in terms of reward, because there's natural exploration that happens when the greedy classifier makes mistakes. But this is only in settings with this high stochasticity and low reward, which might not scale up when you look at the full population of taxpayers. So this is what we see here for why greedy might do better in terms of reward, but obviously greedy does not do better in terms of population estimation. It's very, very biased. In fact, it's the most biased, and the reward that it gets is not that much more. In fact, the confidence intervals are overlapping. We also use another approach called UCV, which basically is uncertainty sampling. So we select according to the mean plus the uncertainty of the model, and that gets you, good reward in some cases, but the bias is again sort of unacceptable, and it's also higher variance and more no change rate. So this is the worst of the methods, or the baselines that we tried. So just to demonstrate that ABS can give you, that reward precision trade-off or variance trade-off, you can see here's a random sampling of hyperparameters that we selected. Just randomly select hyperparameters for all those levers that you can pull. And you can see it gives you fine-grained control, but as you get to that higher reward selection, the variance can go up in more of the settings. We can keep that variance down with some techniques that we use in the paper. And then, as you select more optimal methods, so as you go to greedy, as you go to those like better ABS settings, what happens is there's a tendency for these more optimal models to choose tax returns that are higher income. So you'll see that the greater than 1 million is the most selected among the more optimal ones, but the least selected amongst the random ones. So this shows a bit of the dynamics in terms of total positive income of the selection mechanisms. And another thing that can drive this is heteroscedasticity in the errors. So our uncertainty-based method basically also selected the over 1 million base even more than the greedy methods. And that's because of the correlation between errors in that area and the income itself. And so there's a lot more uncertainty in that region. Yeah, so the takeaways are basically you can yield returns almost as high as greedy selection and the most optimal methods with careful sampling and Horowitz-Thompson estimation. This suggests that maybe a unified optimize and estimate program can give you more fine-grained control over how you're doing sampling and trading off these different objectives. You can model-based methods are not guaranteed to be unbiased, but in practice, you can reduce that bias by adding a bit of randomness, right? So random exploration is really important to reduce any bias and make sure you don't fall into these feedback loops. More optimal methods tend to sample higher incomes, and heteroscedasticity also tends to drive sampling of higher incomes because of that uncertainty mechanism. So yeah, thanks so much for listening. I will turn it back to Aaron, I believe, or Alan.
Yeah, this is Alan Plumley. Really appreciated those presentations, and hopefully I can offer some useful insights and even questions. But to do that, I want to begin with a bit of context. It was alluded to several different ways here, but from tax year 2011 to 2019, the overall volume of individual income tax returns grew by about 8.5%. And during that time, the number of individual income tax audits declined by 73%, driven largely by the reduction in budgets. And during that time, the NRP sample size declined by about 43%, even though statistically we would sort of expect the same sample size throughout because of the objectives of the survey of the sample. So that reduction undermines the quality of the NRP-based audits, the estimates derived from them. And that would prompt us otherwise to increase the NRP sample size to maintain the quality of the estimates. However, those same audits became a larger percentage of all the audits conducted by the IRS. Oh, and by the way, my scale on the y-axis here is wrong. It's off by 1,000. So it begins at about 1% and it goes up over a little bit over 2%. But that, even if the sample size were to remain relatively stable, it would be an increasing percentage of all audits. And that, of course, undermines the operational audit program objectives, where they are very much focused on revenue and not just random audits. And so the pressure from the operational perspective would be to decrease the NRP sample size. And so we've got these two competing perspectives on the nature of NRP. And the question then becomes, can we get the best of both worlds by using operational audits to mitigate the loss of some NRP audits? And all three of these papers are seeking to address that, but they take two different approaches. The first approach is to use the operational audits selected for operational reasons. And the second approach is to select operational and random audits to meet revenue and measurement objectives simultaneously. So the Turk and Rizzo papers took the first approach, and the Henderson et al. Paper takes the second approach. Now, the first one has the advantage of not requiring any change to the operational program. The second one has the potential advantage of better balancing these two competing objectives, the revenue and the compliance measurement objectives. Well, before talking about the three papers individually, I want to express a major concern I have. This is me speaking, not necessarily IRS at large. And they all begin with the presumption that we need unbiased estimates of the gross underreporting tax gap. I've been involved with estimating the tax gap for 37 years, and I can't recall a single instance when the gross tax gap estimate has influenced tax policy, tax law, or even tax administration. What has had an impact is estimates of noncompliance at the line item level. That's what we really need, unbiased compliance estimates at the line item level, ideally for each year. Now, when we do report out estimates of the tax gap, and in this case, particularly the individual income tax underreporting gap, we continue to observe every time that the extent of noncompliance, whether measured by dollars or in percentage terms, depends very heavily on how visible that income type is to the IRS. And so if it's subject to substantial information reporting and withholding, like wages, then noncompliance on that line item is very low. Moving to the right, if it's subject to substantial information reporting, but not withholding, something like interest and dividends, for example, it's still fairly low misreporting, but it's more than if withholding had been in place. Moving to the right, if the income is subject to some information reporting, but not comprehensive, and here there are a number of examples. You can think in terms of capital gains, where maybe we have information on sales price, but not the basis. It's sort of some information reporting, but not comprehensive. And then the noncompliance is higher yet, but it's highest in the right-hand category, where income is subject to little or no information reporting, something like sole proprietor income, self-employment. And it gets even worse, because yes, we are interested in well, let me back up. What we're not interested in is to try to estimate the amount of noncompliance that would be detected by NRP if NRP audited everybody. We're not trying to estimate that, because we know that even our best audits are not omniscient. They don't detect everything. And so our tax gap estimates have to estimate the extent to which there's non-detection going on here. And as you might expect, that non-detection is very highly correlated with these groups. So the more visible the income is, the easier it is to detect non-compliance, and vice versa. Well, with that background, we have a problem. The operational data at the line item level are very poor. In fact, my own conviction is it may be cheaper to increase the number of random audits than it would be to fix the operational line item data. It's a pretty serious challenge. Anyway, let's take a look at the three papers. The Turk paper, they logically accounted for the selection bias, and they used both diff and diff squared to control for that in their model. Because the operational audits are taken from a very different part of the distribution from the population, I think they might rather consider using something like a percentile distribution of the diff scores in each activity code. That might help to get better resolution on the bias correction. And in their risk model, they draw randomly from the operational audits and assign a normalized weight of 1 to each. I'm thinking they might rather stratify the operational audit sample using the NRP substrata and then normalize their weights the same way that they would for the NRP audits, making the two sets a bit more comparable, I think. Now, when they use the mix of operational and NRP audits, in their paper, they spent a fair amount of time showing that using the mixed data or even the NRP data doesn't do a great job of predicting the operational outcomes. And I'm thinking, well, of course not. I don't think there's really any need to do that. That's not the primary test. And I'm wondering if they've tried doing some bootstrapping, getting some confidence intervals around their two major mix definitions, the 50% and 25%. And then what I'd really like to see would be a way to transform the operational data that are used so that they're fully compatible with the NRP data, both the weights and the outcomes, so that it's as if it were audited by an NRP audit, so that you could then actually combine all the data and tabulate various compliance estimates directly from the data rather than from a model. I guess what I'm saying is maybe use a model to update the data rather than use a model to produce estimates. And then, of course, I'd like to see this for other activity codes as well. Well, moving to the Rizzo paper, I liked the idea that they accounted for operational cases that were surveyed. That means these were cases that were considered for audit, but they were set aside and not audited. And I'm thinking, though, that imputing tax change only to some of them may be only part of the solution. It may actually be problematic. Given the difference in the exam intensity between NRP audits and operational exams, I'm wondering whether we should have an adjustment to even the positive tax change cases as well from the operational group, so that they mimic an NRP audit. I don't know if just playing with the weights does that. And in fact, I question the use of weights of 1 for operational audits because they don't equally represent the population. They represent themselves, but what we'd really like to get is population estimates with presumably fewer NRP audits. And that actually is my next concern. It's not clear how to use this approach if the NRP sample were much smaller. I don't think our problem is how to incorporate operational audits with the current NRP data, but what would we do if the NRP data, the sample were smaller? And if using diff scores is needed to help overcome selection bias in the operational cases, well, that depends on having a robust diff model for each stratum. But that's not guaranteed if the NRP sample continues to shrink over time. So there's certainly some challenges here. Well, in the Henderson paper, of course, they've introduced a second objective, not just compliance measurement objective, but also reward maximization, where the reward in this case is revenue collected from the audits. And the need here, though, is we need to account for the fact that we're budget constrained. Total reward is subject to a budget constraint, unlike one-armed bandits. And their audits, the cost of these audits widely vary. And so, you know, if they were all the same cost, then that would be fairly simple, but they're dramatically different in cost. And so our selection needs to be based on something like the revenue to cost ratio. And so that just adds complexity to the reward maximization objective. There's reference in their paper to the no change rate being not a good thing. And of course it's not. But I would suggest that the no change rate in NRP audits isn't inherently anywhere near as bad as it is in the risk-based audits, because the taxpayers were told up front they were just selected at random in order for IRS to maintain its selection methods. And I'm not sure if they do, but I think they should also tell them that their audit could be quite educational for them and may even result in a refund. So yes, no change rates is something you need to deal with. It's not fun for anybody, but it's even less fun in the risk-based arena. So I would have liked to have seen in this paper a comparison of the metrics between the various alternatives they looked at and the status quo, which is where the two objectives are separated. And you know, are we, particularly depending on the relative sizes of our samples, the random versus risk-based portion, how well those do relative to the status quo would be very helpful information. And as a little tidbit here, diff, it's pronounced diff, but it stands simply for discriminant function. It's been amazing how many different creative assumptions have been made about what that I stands for. The I is really just the I in the word discriminant that follows D. That's all it is. So diff stands for discriminant function. Anyway, it was fun to read these papers. I hope these thoughts are helpful. I'll turn it back to Aaron.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for your insight. I just want to maybe touch on some of the questions, if you haven't already put them in the question and answer box. Alex, I know you answered this one in the text, but I thought this one was pretty interesting, coming from Nina Olson, obviously national taxpayer advocate for more than 18 years. Appreciate your service. But this is to Alex. Have you considered using national taxpayer advocate cases for EITC where the TAS gets more than 56 to 65% relief? It seems like they actually have some data from not only correspondence, but also the field.
Yeah, I thought that, thanks Nina for that comment. I think that's a great idea. That could be very helpful especially if you were trying to incorporate the correspondence audits, because a lot of times in the correspondence process, you may get an adjustment or disallowance of the earned income tax credit, but it's simply because the taxpayer never replied. So you don't know whether they didn't reply because they are not entitled to it, or they just didn't get contacted, or they didn't have the wherewithal. So I think that would be very interesting way to incorporate that, to figure out which of those cases are best to incorporate into any model.
Great, Alex. While I have you here, another one from Will Boning, talking about the Heckman model that I think you used for bias adjustment. And one thing, addressing the bias, can you speak to any instruments that you've been able to control for that bias in the first stage?
Yeah, there are variables we used in that first stage that are not in the compliance model. We basically looked at geography and tax year dummies in the audit probability model that aren't included in the subsequent regressions. Basically, we were able to calculate the distance between the auditor and the audit and use that as an instrument to identify that audit probability equation. But yeah, Will's absolutely right that that's a standard problem with these approaches.
Great, thanks. Another one from Nina. This one's directed towards Peter, and you might have answered it in the text, but I think it's important to maybe respond. Obviously, being the national taxpayer advocate, looking at some of these random audits, being a burden to taxpayers and things of that nature. Why do we need more, I think, audits in terms of random as opposed to fewer and better selected audits? I know you're trying to correct for some of that and bolster some of that, but maybe you could respond.
Yeah, I think really the audit budget, in my opinion, should probably be optimized year to year to meet the policy objectives, right? And so I think in our work, what we're trying to do is, with the constrained, very constrained resources that we have, we're trying to optimize for these multiple objectives and make the best use of the limited resources. And so that way, trying to meet this population estimation objective, as well as, your standard identifying this reporting objective. So I think no matter what, you have to think about the number of audits, like optimizing the number of audits or the selection of audits to meet your policy objectives. And we're exploring that area of how do you make that selection that makes best use of the limited resources that you have. And I think the reason that you need some level of randomness goes back to the machine learning research that I mentioned, which basically shows if you don't have randomness and you do, well, first of all, you need the randomness for unbiased selection, or unbiased estimation. But also there's a secondary problem, and a lot of research has showed if you don't have any randomness at all, and you use risk selection to optimize for this the sample, what happens is your algorithm can get stuck in a feedback loop. So that means you don't break out of the space that you're looking at, and you might start to make wrong selections. So you need some level of randomness to explore what you should be doing, because it might be that you need to move over to a different space. Of course, you can use other techniques, and you can bring in other data sources and bring in other mechanisms to make the selection process even better. But probably you need some level of randomness or external information to make the selection process as optimal and policy effective as possible.
Thanks, Peter. Question from Richard. Just, is the bandit method an alternative for using IRS major strata and substrata? Is that a way to maybe eliminate the strata approach?
So we use the strata, because we use the NRP sample, we do use the strata for population estimation, because we have to back out of we're doing a subsample of a subsample. So we have to back out the full population estimate. So we do use them, but the sampling mechanisms themselves don't use the current strata at all. But you can see from the graphs later on the presentation, the selection does correlate a little bit with the strata, though not quite. But in terms of that high income range, you do see some of that correlation with that strata. Yeah, we don't use it in any way other than for the population estimation. So it is an alternative. There are ways to include the strata if you wanted to, but we don't really do that.
Great, thanks. Did you see the one from Thomas Hertz, greedy bandits? Can you plot audit selection rates as a function of the true tax change for each method? I think it would reveal a random selection not only for aids exploration, but also ensures that the audit risk does not drop below zero, relatively high threshold for tax underreporting. It is important for maintaining incentives to comply among the distribution of potential non-compliance, yet random selection is inefficient to achieve the latter objective. Wouldn't it be better to use a threefold way: regression, classifier, and random? Maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we don't fully explore compliance or the selection rate in each strata here. That's, compliance, like broad-based compliance is another sort of policy objective. I think because the ABS method does do random selection in sort of a bucketed or like stratified way, you do get some of that randomness, right? So hypothetically, there would be some sort of compliance effect, but I don't think we can explore that in the simulations that we have, but we'll certainly take a look at doing what you suggested, which is, plot audit selection rate over the true tax change, and we'll maybe in future work we'll take a look at those sorts of effects.
Great, thanks, Peter. Just to follow up on Nina Olson's comment about maybe I put that in there about random audits. She was talking about operational audits. Why do we need so many operational audits instead of maybe finding the non-compliance in a better way?
Oh, I see. Okay. I think that's an interesting point. I think that probably you could definitely look at, like I said, you could use it. You could look at using other external mechanisms to like further optimize this process. I think we don't do that in this work because we're looking at this particular problem. But I think you could, bring in further information, think about balancing the different types of audits or other compliance mechanisms to bring those into this optimization objective and really figure out like how to balance among these different compliance mechanisms. But I think that's probably for future work since we have a lot here already. So, but yeah, that's a really interesting point and probably worth exploring.
Great, thanks. I just want to ask anybody, Peter, Lou, Alex, about maybe addressing any Alan's points about differential audit intensity between NRP and ops audits, or basically anything else that he had bringing up in the discussion.
I think just to talk about the taking into account cost of audits, I think that's definitely true. There's an added basically layer to this is that different audits cost different amounts to the budget. We didn't take it into account for this work, but again, future work might explore that. I think one thing that you have to be careful of, though, is that once you start taking into account cost of the audit, there are other effects that can happen, right? Like you might stop auditing part of that, income range or, different parts of the taxpayer base because it's too costly, even though there's a lot of misreporting there. So to a point that was in the questions, there are compliance effects when you start to take into account cost. And so it's really, in my opinion, you have to be careful, and it's definitely an interesting area of future work to figure out how to take into account that cost without having these other effects that can happen. So it's really important to take into account like the full picture. I definitely agree with that, and I think makes for really interesting exploration to do in the future.
Great, thanks.
Just a couple comments on Alan's comment. So I would push back a little bit on the premise of this is to get an unbiased population estimate as in our model. It's really to get an unbiased estimate of risk assessment. And so if I can conditional on the line items, if I can get an unbiased estimate of the risk of that or the underreporting of that on it, then I'm a long way towards a building block towards tax gap. But that's not the only use of a risk model like this. It actually can be used to direct the sample in the next phase of random auditing. And I do agree that we need better information on line item adjustments, but we're also, by controlling for the line item adjustment for the line items, we are trying to tease out that correlation between here's the line item that they report and here's the tax change. That's kind of backing into, how that visibility chart. But I also somewhat disagree that it would be cheaper to do more operational audits and to enhance exams infrastructure about capturing data, because I think while that would be a larger fixed cost, that would have a huge benefit down the road and improve the feedback loop that exam has in their selection processes, which are convoluted. There's more than just returns selected by diff. They're selected for all sorts of different ways, and there's areas where the discriminant function just doesn't exist. So,
yeah, and to add to that, in terms of the line item estimation point from Alan, I think that's also an interesting point, but you would need to do something similar to one of these methods to do line item estimation in an unbiased way, or to do estimation in general. So either way, it's a more complicated problem, and it probably changes how you sample and the distribution of sampling, but either way, you still sort of need to do something like the methods that all the speakers talked about to do that line item estimation, I think.
Can I address one point from just a clarifying point, the weights of 1 for the OP audits? Alan had questioned using weights of 1 for the OP audits. I just wanted to clarify that's only for one of the estimators, for the most conservative estimator, the OP self-representing. Our other estimators do not have a weight of only 1 for the OP audits. They have a much larger weight for the OPs who are coming in. I just wanted to clarify that.
Great, thanks. Does pre-selected strata lead machine learning algorithms into a low learning environment by fencing off return selections that feed into the algorithm? Peter, I think this one's for you.
That's a good question. We didn't explore that per se. I think there's ways to, adjust the strata, and I think the strata are adjusted from time to time, though I'm not quite sure on that. Others can speak to that better than I can. But I think that in terms of machine learning itself, speaking purely about machine learning, I think it is better to have dynamically adjusted strata if you're using strata, because it gives a little bit more flexibility. We use dynamically adjusting strata in the ABS sort of risk distribution adjustment. That being said, I think there are ways to, if you're doing selection, to adjust those strata pretty easily, but I don't have any experiments to sort of say definitively one way or another what's the real effect of that. But I do think it's better to dynamically adjust strata if you're using them in general, because you can get around some of the effects of that discontinuity in the stratum. But that's just like sort of a general machine learning answer. I don't really have any results for this particular situation.
Great, thanks. Panelists, I want to say thank you for your research and your work and sharing it with us. Ellen, I want to thank you for your insights into your comments, and thank you for the attendees. I'm going to pass it over to Alex Ruda, who's an operational research analyst at RAS IRS. Hi, Alex.
Thank you, Aaron. Hi, good morning, and welcome to session 2 of today's conference. I'm Alex Ruda. The topic for this session will be burden versus opportunity, and we have 3 papers. The first, the Spiderweb of Pass-Through Tax Planning, will be presented by Ryan Hess, postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. The second paper, Automatic Tax Filing, Simulating a Pre-Populated Form 1040 Automatic Tax Form, will be presented by Catherine Lim, an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And the third paper, The Distribution of the Individual Income Tax Under Reporting Tax Gap, will be presented by Drew Johns, an economist with IRS RAS. Our discussant for today's papers is Steve Rosenthal, a senior fellow in the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. As a reminder, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. Thank you, and we'll turn now to the first presentation. Ryan?
Thanks for that introduction, Alex. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to have this opportunity to present our research today. I'm Ryan Hess, and the paper I'm presenting is titled The Spiderweb of Partnership Tax Planning. And this has been a really interesting project to work on with a multidisciplinary group of co-authors. So Jacob Golden and Daniel Ho are faculty at the Stanford Law School. And then Annette Ports, Rebecca Lester, and myself specialize in tax research. And Emily Black and Nancy Paul are the computer science and machine learning specialists on this paper. And we leverage all of those disciplines to be able to examine the tax planning choices of pass-through businesses with a specific focus on partnership entities and how the partnership organizational structures can influence those tax planning choices. Because we know that partnerships are more flexible in the way that they're able to organize their ownership structures and have distributions to their owners and of income and losses. So we're interested in how that flexibility is able to impact their tax planning choices. So to examine this question, we do it in 2 main steps. First is we construct these partnership organization structures. We link partnerships with their owners to be able to examine the size, the ownership patterns, and the complexity. Once we're able to do that, we then test the features of both the partnership and the organization that the partnership is a part of to see which features are associated with tax planning. In order to do this, we utilize audit outcomes for partnerships that have undergone an audit to establish that tax planning exists or tax non-compliant exists. And we leverage machine learning models to see how well we're able to predict whether or not, conditional on an audit, there was an audit adjustment made for that partnership. So we're interested in this area and partnerships specifically for a number of reasons. The first is that partnership entities are very prevalent, with around 4.5 million partnership returns being filed each year. Partnerships are actually the fastest growing entity type over the last about 20 years, growing faster than C corporations or S corporations. And they're economically significant, controlling about $30 trillion in assets. And despite the significance and prevalence of partnerships, much of the prior research that looks at tax avoidance focuses on C corporations. And that's in part due to data that's available for these publicly traded corporations. Another reason we're interested in partnerships is because of the low tax rate that exists on partnership income. A paper by Cooper et al. Estimates that partnerships, the income that is passed through partnerships is only taxed at about 16%, which is about half of that on C corporations and about 10 percentage points less than that for S corporations. In addition to the low tax rate, there's also a substantial portion of income that goes unreported. And I'm going to talk about that when we talk about the tax gap in just a couple of slides. So we can visualize the growth in partnership entities over time in this graph. So this is over about the past 20 years. In 2003, there were partnerships which are represented by this green line. There are only about 2.3 million partnerships, but by 2020, there are over 4.5 million partnerships filing. We can see over that same time period, S corporations are increasing, but not at the same rate as partnerships. And then C corporations are actually decreasing over that time in terms of the number that are filing. And then getting to the partnership income that goes underreported and looking at the tax gap, which we know is the difference between the estimated true tax liability and that's actually paid. The gross tax gap for the most recent estimates available for underreporting is around 350 billion. C corporations only make up about 10% of that, about 37 billion, but individual business income, of which partnership income would be a part, accounts for about 110 billion of that. So almost a third of the underreporting is due to this individual business income. So we believe that partnerships are important both for the income that they do report, but also for the income that they don't report. So given the significance of partnerships, what do we know already? Well, there's been some prior work, and this list is certainly not comprehensive, but there are a few studies that I wanted to highlight. There's this Cooper paper that I mentioned previously, where we know that partnership structures are opaque, and they're primarily owned by high earners. And as I mentioned, there's this relatively low federal tax rate on partnership income. And we know that it's not just domestic owners of partnership structures. Love 2021 finds that a significant portion of the income from partnership actually flows to foreign owners. They estimate that about 17% partnership income is flowing internationally. And since 2011, about $1 trillion is flowing to tax havens specifically. So it's important to look at how these partnerships are organized and how these distributions are made. And related to that, the tax gap that I just mentioned, that $110 billion of underreporting, recent paper by Guyton et al. Show that partnership tax evasion is likely understated. So we can think of that 110 billion as a lower bound estimate, and that the underreporting problem is actually much larger than that. And then finally, related to these structures, these partnership organization structures, there's a paper by Agrawal et al. That look at publicly traded C corporations and then examine whether there's a partnership entity within the corporate structure, and find that those corporations that have a partnership tend to report lower tax rates. But again, this is on the corporate space. They do this partly because of data that's available. But we're interested in looking at privately owned partnerships and how their organizational structure affects their tax planning choices. So in order to look at these private partnerships, we use IRS data to identify around 3.7 million partnership entities for tax year 2014. And we've just initially started looking at tax year 2014, this single year, because we want to make sure that we're able to build out these structures correctly before we expand to more years in the future. If we were trying to do this for a decade's worth of data at a time, it would overwhelm our data capabilities as we're trying to create these structures, because they're incredibly complex and there's a lot of data involved in each one of these networks that we're creating. We know from the IRS data books that this represents the near universe of partnerships. In order to create these ownership structures to link partnerships to the ultimate owners, we require non-zero income amounts in order to create these linkages and to understand the ownership patterns. Once we've made those limitations, we create the structures and we classify these partnership structures in either simple or complex structures. And we define simple as a single partnership that is owned wholly by individual taxpayers, by 1040 taxpayers. And then complex would be all other organizational types, such as organizations that have multiple partnerships within them, or their other entities. such as S corporations or trusts within the organization. And I'll provide a couple of examples that we can look at where we can see here's some simple partnership organizations. We have on the left about as simple a partnership as you can get with the orange triangle representing the partnership, paying out to two blue circles, which are the 1040 individual taxpayers. There can be more 1040 individual taxpayers in these organizations, as we can see on the right. But the simple partnerships still always have that one partnership and the individual owners. On the other hand, the complex organizations can either have multiple partnerships, as we can see in the graph on the left, where there's two orange triangles and three owners, or there can be different types of entities. As we can see on the right, represented by the green circle, that would be either an S corporation or a trust that exists in this organization. So those are some examples of some complex partnership organizations, but they can get even more complex than this. As we can see in the next slide, the income can flow through multiple pass-through entities before it ends up at a 1040, before it's reported on a 1040, which can make it more difficult to be able to identify tax noncompliance from the IRS's perspective. It can flow through, as we can see on the right, multiple partnerships before it ends up at an S corporation, a trust, or an individual. And these are already getting very complex, but as we can see on this slide, this is where the title of our paper, The Spiderweb of Tax Planning, really comes into its own. As we can see, these ownership structures can get extremely complex with many multiple partnerships and income that's flowing through those partnerships many times before it ends up at a 1040, ends up being reported by an individual. And it's plausible to think that some of these connections are made not necessarily for a business purpose, business operational reason, but indeed to avoid taxes. This could be part of a tax planning structure. So we're interested to see if we can use features of these networks to be able to identify tax noncompliance using machine learning, because as we can imagine, this would be extremely complicated to have an individual revenue agent go in and try and identify tax noncompliance in this big web of partnerships, and then trace that out to the ultimate owner. So when we break down the population of simple versus complex organizations, we have it broken down here, simple on the left, complex on the right, by the number of partners. And we can see that the number of organizations, most of them are, the majority of them, I should say, are simple organizations. About 80% are simple, with 20% being these complex organizations. But despite the lean towards simple organizations, we look at some simple summary statistics looking at income and loss. The complex organizations we can see on the right are generally larger in terms of the income and losses that they are reporting. So that's kind of step one, where we look at these partnerships. We try and get an idea of what they look like, what their makeup, some of the income that goes through them. Next, we're going to look and see if we can predict tax noncompliance. And as I said before, to do this, we're going to look at a subsample of partnerships that have undergone an audit. And then we're going to test whether we can predict among this subsample of audited partnerships, whether an audit adjustment was eventually imposed. And we're going to utilize ridge regressions, which are a linear model, and then random forests, which are nonlinear. The features that we include in our model, we can categorize into three main buckets. Those related to the partnership, such as their sales, international operations, or whether they reported a loss. Those related to the audit, such as the IRS revenue agent's rank that conducted the audit, the amount of time it took to complete an audit. And then finally, the features related to the partnership organization or the partnership network, including how many K1s a partnership is issuing and receiving, and how many individual partners are in the organization as a whole, how many partnerships as corporations and trusts, to try and capture some of the features of the partnership organization as a whole instead of just the individual partnership. So we run our ridge regressions and our random forest models each twice, once not including the network features and once including the network features. And I want to draw attention mostly to the model accuracy. What we find when we don't include the network features in the ridge regression is that our model can predict whether there was adjustment about 73% of the time. What's interesting is when we include those network features in this linear model is that we find that our model accuracy actually decreases to about 71%, decreases a little bit, which provides a little bit of evidence that there may be some nonlinear relationships between these network features and tax noncompliance. In the first random forest model without network features, our model accuracy is about 66%. But when we include the network features, the model accuracy jumps quite significantly to about 74%. Which is the highest of all the models, of all the 4 models that we run, which suggests that there may be some nonlinear patterns in the data and provides evidence where we're looking forward to implementing even some more advanced machine learning techniques in the future, such as deep neural networks, which can take advantage of these large swaths of data and these nonlinear patterns as well. So overall, we believe that our study has helped contribute to our understanding of what partnership organizations look like and their complexity and how they're structured, provide some preliminary evidence that the network features of these organizations are beneficial in identifying tax noncompliance, and then some early evidence that there is some nonlinear relationships in these associations. In the future, in this work, we're looking to expand the sample period from just 2014 to expand it to include more years, and then also expand the scope of the features that we're including in our model, and then implementing new models that can take advantage of large amounts of data and these non-linear relationships like deep neural networks. So with that, I thank everyone for participating. I look forward to Steve's comments, and then I hand the time over to Catherine.
Hello. All right, my name is Catherine Lim, and today I'm going to be talking about some work I have with colleagues at the Treasury and a co-author at Dartmouth College. So our paper is about automated tax filing, and we're simulating a pre-populated Form 1040. I have to give the standard disclaimer that the views expressed in the presentation are those of my own and don't necessarily reflect those of the Treasury or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so the paper is motivated by a number of facts. So the first one is that tax filing is burdensome. So there are a lot of estimates of compliance costs of filing taxes, but they're all relatively large. There's also some evidence that filing burden is not proportionate to income, that the relative time and out-of-pocket costs are higher for those with lower levels of AGI. And then finally, we know that the IRS already has some information on our income through third-party information reporting on a variety of sources. So put together, it leads to this appealing idea that the IRS could fill out your tax return for you. So some of the potential benefits of this are to reduce filing burden and distribute it perhaps more progressively. There's the potential that it could increase EITC and child tax credit take-up. So we know that EITC take-up is high, but it's not 100%. And that a large part of that is due to non-filing, and that IRS outreach generally targets filers. So possible that pre-populated returns could change filing behavior. And more generally, it could prompt those who are non-filers and owed refunds to file, or those who are non-filers and are delinquent and owe taxes to become filers. So it's possible that by generating a pre-populated return for these individuals, it could change their filing behavior. So in this project, we imagine that the IRS prepares a tax return using only information returns that they've received for that year, for that tax year. And then they use the filing status and dependents from the prior year return. So that would be the 1040 from the prior year. And what we do is under this, regime, we quantify the share of filing taxpayers for whom this procedure is successful. And so we think the paper provides some concrete results, both on how successful this type of idea would be for filers, but then we also do some work to look at non-filers, which we think is sort of new in this space. And we think we provide some concrete results that policymakers could consider if they wanted to move forward on this type of regime. So I want to be clear about what this paper does not do, in particular, given this current conference and the audience. We do not exhaustively discuss or quantify the benefits, the costs, or the behavioral responses of implementing a pre-populated regime. So we talk a little bit about it in the paper, and I'm happy to talk about it in the discussion and hear comments, but that's definitely, the paper does not do that. Okay, so in the paper, we use two different approaches to measure success. So the first approach we call an upper bound approach. And in this approach, we call returns a success if they don't have a situation where the pre-population procedure would automatically fail for the IRS. So an example here would be there's Schedule C income that's reported on a return, and it doesn't equal the amount of income that's on an information return, an associated information return. And obviously there are many reasons why this could happen, but if this happens, there's no way the IRS could possibly get that Schedule C income correct. So we call this an upper bound because we think about a lot of different situations. There's details in the paper. We have 22 failure situations, but we can't enumerate all failure scenarios. The second, sorry, that should be a 2. The second approach is called the lower bound approach. And in this, I think this is a more intuitive approach. We directly estimate tax liability using an in-house version of NBER TaxSim. So we take the information returns and assume, the dependent and filing status from last year and actually estimate tax liability. We consider it a success when that calculated liability matches the reported tax liability that on the taxpayer submitted return within a tolerance threshold. We call this a lower bound because the tax calculator could be richer. It's a pretty good tax calculator, but there are some features that one could imagine potentially adding if you were implementing this type of program. I will say that when we're talking about success, our goal, whether or not it's the appropriate goal, but our goal is to match what the taxpayer filed. So that might not be, their true legal tax liability, but it's what they submitted. So that's what we will be comparing the pre-populated returns to. Okay, so the procedure that we do, I described it, but we do it for tax year 2019. And for filers, we're going to use the 2019 INSOL file. So that's around 344,000 tax units. So we take those tax units as our sample. We match their 2018 1040s and their 2019 information returns. And those are the pieces of information we use to generate the pre-populated returns. For the non-filer data, I'll describe a little more in detail later, but it's a 0.1% sample of 55 million 2019 non-filers. So the main results from the paper are just the success rates using the two different approaches. So when we talk about the lower bound approach, this is the one where we calculate the liability directly. We find that we're successfully able to calculate tax liability for around 41% of tax units. And that means within a threshold of $100. Under the upper bound approach, the success rate is around 48% overall, using similar tolerance levels. So success rates are higher among those with lower AGI. And you'll see here that the upper bound and lower bound, they were in quotes because they're not technically strictly upper bounds and lower bounds. As you can see, they cross here. And that's in the paper, explained in the paper, but basically you can have a time where you don't have that you do have a failure situation, but you get the calculation right because let's say they owe 0 tax liability, so changes in the income don't necessarily affect tax liability. So that's happening at the lower end of the income distribution, but the main takeaway here is that success rates decline as income increases. And I think that makes intuitive sense as tax returns get more complex as income increases generally. So under our upper bound approach, the most common failures is actually Schedule C income not matching information returns. I think that makes intuitive sense. That's common among all income levels. Schedule C filing is spread across the income distribution. If we look among high income taxpayers, a main reason for why their pre-populated return fails is they're more likely to itemize And itemizers almost always have things like charitable deductions, and the IRS doesn't have information returns on those. They're also more likely to have rent and royalty income, which results in a failure situation as well. When we look at the characteristics of those who were successful under both methods, they're pretty similar, generally speaking. So they're individuals that have lower average and median income, as you saw, and tax liability. And they were actually less likely to use a paid preparer, which makes sense if their returns are less complex. But 43% of them actually did use a paid preparer, suggesting that if they were willing to look at the pre-populated return and felt comfortable with what it said, they would perhaps be able to not use a paid preparer. They were younger and less likely to have dependents and less likely to be married, because again, those things make the tax return more complicated. And it's important to note that among unsuccessful returns, the median number of failure situations was actually 1. So we think this means that it's possible that these people could also benefit the people for whom the pre-populated return was unsuccessful, because they might be able, if they were comfortable, be willing to look and say, oh, they don't have my deductions on my Schedule C, or they have the income wrong on my Schedule C. I need to fix my Schedule C, and may still benefit from the rest of the pre-population. Okay, so this title kind of ran off the page, but here I'm going to walk us through a table in our paper that we think is particularly useful, possibly for policymakers as they think through whether or not they would want to think about this kind of program for everyone, or whether they would want to limit it to certain subsets of taxpayers. So we start with the narrowest subset, the people for whom we think that pre-population is most likely to be successful. So these are single individuals with no dependents, only wages, only EITC, CTC credits and deductions that are observed, and income under $100,000. So this makes up 20% of filers. And we have about an 80% success rate across the 2 different measures. So pretty successful, but it's important to note this is not 100%. So even among the simplest cases, the pre-populated return does not work all of the time. As we expand the groups of taxpayers that would be eligible for pre-populated returns, we allow for married individuals, allow for them to have dependents. You can see in the red here, these are the marginal success rates. So the marginal success rates are lower, meaning that these groups, as you add them, they do have lower success rates. And that's because year to year, people might change filing status. They may have kids, or kids might leave the household, or have other dependents. Next, we add types of income that have information reporting, interest, dividends, Social Security. You can see here the marginal success rates are pretty high for these groups, and that's partially because there's the information reporting on those. But again, they're not 100%. And then finally, I'm not going to go through every single line, but we add a bunch of different groups. And when we get to the bottom, the people who we think are going to be the hardest to have pre-populated returns be successful for, that indeed is the case. When we allow for all income types, you can see the marginal success rate is relatively low, around 20% for those groups. And then when we go to the full population, eliminating, you can have any type of deduction, any type of credit, you can see the marginal success rate is very low, between 10 and 20%. And that's where we get our overall population level success rate between 41 and 48%. So we think that this table provides some concrete numbers for people contemplating what groups of taxpayers they might consider doing pre-populated returns for. Okay, so the last part of the paper focuses on non-filers. So what we do here is we draw a 0.1% sample from 55 million non-filers, and we consider 2019 non-filers to be in our sample. Those are people who we would have generated a pre-populated return for. So they had to have a 2019 information return with a US address. And we don't include them if they were part of a 2018 married filing jointly couple where one spouse was a filer, because those would be people who would be in our filer population, although obviously it would have failed because they're no longer married filing jointly in 2019. So among our non-filers, around 85% appear not to have a filing obligation. Again, this is using a pre-populated number, so we don't have all the information, but based on the information the IRS would have, 85% appear not to have a filing obligation, and then the rest, 15% appear to have a filing obligation. Among those without a filing obligation, they're a little bit older. The median age is 59 years old. 8% have a childless EITC calculated to be bigger than 0, and 0.7% have a child EITC. 17% are owed a potential refund, but the median amount is $200. So that's consistent with kind of what we know about people who aren't filing. They might get a refund, but it might be very small. So it's possible if they received a pre-populated return, they might submit it and receive their refund, and that might be worth it to them. Among those with a filing obligation, 5% had a childless EITC bigger than 0, 10% had a child EITC, 43% have a potential refund, the median amount is $900, and 55% potentially owe, with a median amount of $1,500 that they owe. Again, these are calculated, like I said, from information returns, and using, if they did file in 2018, any of that information. So these could be, not completely accurate, but they're kind of what we think would be pre-populated for this population under this type of regime. Okay, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the issues that could come up with a pre-populated program, but some important ones to think about are that information returns would need to come in earlier for the IRS to be able to process them and do this procedure. This is a big shift in compliance and calculation burden onto the IRS, as I'm sure many of the participants could be thinking about. And I think that there are some pretty uncertain effects on compliance and revenue. Pre-population could serve as a nudge, leading people to overcomply, to just accept what is given to them, even if it doesn't include sort of deductions that they know that they're owed, or to undercomply relative to current tax liability. And it could increase the salience of tax authorities' information and the information set that they have, and change perceived audit probabilities or tax morale, all in sort of really uncertain ways. Not necessarily all bad. There could be good effects as well, but I think there's a lot of implementation issues that would have to be considered. Okay, so just to conclude, we think that pre-populated returns are an intuitively appealing idea. It would be successful for 40 to 50% of the population. And as I mentioned, there are many implementation obstacles that would need to be overcome. And we would need to be really careful about the unintended effects if we were to implement something like this. So that's all I have, and I'll pass it on to my next presenter. And I'm very sorry I have all of these extra slides, so I'm going to skip through them to the next, so we can get to the next presenter. So Drew, I'm going to pass it to you.
All right, thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. So the title of my paper is The Distribution of the Tax Year 2011 through 2013 Individual Income Tax and Self-Employment Tax Underreporting Tax Gap. I do have to acknowledge that the views expressed in this paper do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Treasury or the Internal Revenue Service. In this paper, I am combining the individual income tax and self-employment tax underreporting tax gaps together, primarily because they are both reported on the same individual income tax return, and also because we use the same methodology and data underlying that methodology to estimate those. Okay, so to fulfill its mission, the IRS works to promote voluntary compliance by providing taxpayer services and education and strategically enforcing the tax law. The IRS employs a balanced compliance enforcement strategy that includes an enforcement presence across all types of tax returns. That's important because the IRS enforces the tax law for all taxpayers. But within a given type of tax return, returns that are most likely to have significantly unreported taxes are generally going to be audited at a relatively higher rate. And the IRS has a variety of compliance enforcement strategies and tools that are commensurate with the nature of the non-compliance, including simple math error and clerical error corrections that occur during return processing. IRS has an automated underreporter program where it matches return information to third-party information. And both of those, through the math error corrections and the third-party matching program, both of those can generate notices and adjustments to taxpayer accounts, but neither one of those are considered to be audits themselves or examinations. And then we have examinations, and for simple issues that can be addressed through the taxpayer sending in substantiating documentation through correspondence, we have campus correspondence examinations. If they're a little bit more complicated, that would require a face-to-face examination with an examiner. We have office examinations that are conducted by tax compliance officers or TCOs. The taxpayer would actually go to an IRS office. And for our most complex examinations and returns, you may end up with a revenue agent through a field examination. And the distinction there is revenue agents being more experienced, but also they have the ability to go out and visit a taxpayer's place of business or meet with the taxpayer outside of an IRS office. So the overall objective of tax gap estimation is to measure taxpayer compliance behavior. The important word there is measure. And the focus and challenge of all of this is measuring actual behavior. We do not want to assume what the noncompliance is. We want to observe that noncompliance, establish that it exists, and then use that established noncompliance to sort of project it out to the population. And in the terms of underreporting tax gap, we really can only observe underreporting noncompliance if we conduct an actual examination to establish it. We use the term tax noncompliance when we refer to the tax gap estimates, and tax noncompliance includes both intentional and unintentional errors. We're not able to separate those out because we don't know the mindset of the taxpayer. Our tax gap estimates do not include tax avoidance. So when we say tax avoidance, we're referring to the use of legal means to reduce tax liability. So in other words, these estimates do not reflect what some people call a policy gap. And we generally do not use the term tax evasion. So tax evasion has specific meanings within tax administration. And for us, it usually means intentional noncompliance that rises to the level of criminality. And so tax evasion is some subset of the tax gap estimates and some subset of tax noncompliance, but they are not themselves synonymous with each other. So the tax gap is a tax year concept. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, we take what we call a bottom-up approach to compliance measurement. And this is where we want to establish at a return level through an examination, the non-compliance as opposed to assuming its existence. I'm going to be showing later on these slides the distribution of the tax gap estimates and aligning that with the distribution of examination closures and resources. And so one thing that I do want to note is that we do not, or at least I do not necessarily consider the distribution of the tax gap to be an optimal method for allocating resources. But we are frequently asked about sort of how the examination resources align with the tax gap distribution. And so this is the purpose of the paper and this presentation. So this shows our tax gap map. The tax gap map is our way of trying to visualize and show the allocation of the tax gap by type of tax and tax gap component, where the tax gap components are the underreporting gap, non-filing gap, and underpayment gap. I'm focusing on the underreporting gap. The overall gross tax gap, which is before subtracting off any enforced or other late payments for the tax year 2011 to 2013 time period, was $441 billion. There's a box that's circled there, and within that box, it shows the estimate for the individual income tax underreporting tax gap, which was $245 billion. And the box below it shows the self-employment tax underreporting tax gap, which is $45 billion. So if we add the $245 billion to the $45 billion, we get the total of $290 billion. And that is the base in which the distribution estimates I'll be showing later in the tables is really applicable to, that $290 billion. So at some point in time, if I talk about a share of the tax gap, I'm really referring to that share of that $290 billion. So a lot of people have mentioned this earlier, but the foundation of the individual income tax underreporting tax gap and the self-employment tax underreporting tax gap is data from the National Research Program. So NRP selects a stratified random sample of filed tax returns each year for examination. For this time period, tax year 2011 through 2013, it was roughly in the neighborhood of 14,000 returns per year. In more recent years, the size of that sample is much smaller than it was in previously. But even though actually one thing I do want to mention, the individual income tax and self-employment tax unreporting tax gaps are actually the only components of the tax gap that are based upon NRP data. A lot of times tax gap and NRP, some people try to conflate the two. But in reality, NRP is itself not the tax gap estimate. It provides data into the estimation process. And it's really only providing that data at this point for those two components, individual income tax and self-employment tax. So even though an NRP examination is generally going to be a wider scope and have a consistent set of methods than, say, an operational risk-based examination, we do acknowledge that it's unlikely that examiners can consistently detect all unreported income. And so we have a process or a technique called the econometric technique called detection controlled estimation that we use, DCE for short, to estimate undetected income at the line item. And so we effectively adjust the examiner record amounts for those DCE adjustment amounts. And so in some of the tables later on, when it says DCE adjust, it's actually referring to our final tax gap estimates, which are sort of inflated. I mean, I should say increased relative to what the examiner recommended. And then we use a micro simulation with the tax calculator to reflect a realistic distribution of undetected income. So the IRS stratifies tax returns based on tax return characteristics into mutually exclusive groups for examination and planning. We call these activity codes. Some of these were talked about earlier. I'm going to focus on 270 and 271, which are the activity codes based upon returns that claimed EITC, returns that did not, includes returns that are ineligible for EITC but claimed it, and compliant taxpayers who did not erroneously claim EITC when they're not eligible would not show in those activity classes. They would show in some other activity class. And 281 is the other one to highlight, which is total positive income of $1 million or more. Now, the key factor there is it's reported total positive income. Taxpayers who earn more than $1 million of total positive income, but reported less than $1 million of total positive income are going to fall into a different activity class, not be in 281. So here's my main table that I really probably spend most of my time talking about. So this shows the distribution of tax year 2011 to 2013, the individual and SU tax and reporting tax gaps by activity code. And the first column that I have in this table shows the calendar year 2018 returns, the distribution of those returns. The next two columns show the distribution of the tax gap. There's two metrics here. The examiner determined is what the distribution of the tax gap would be had we based the estimate solely on what the examiners determined it to be, what the examiner recommended adjustment was. And then the next column is the DCE adjusted amount, and that's our actual tax gap estimate. And so the DCE adjusted base, as I showed in the tax gap map, was $290 billion. If we based the tax gap on just what the examiner determined, the estimate would have been $139 billion. So the DCE adjustment amount in aggregate is roughly twice what the estimate would have been had it been based on simply what the examiner determined. And then the last three columns focus on exams closed for FY 2019. The reason why I'm using fiscal year 2019 and calendar year 2018 is because those are the last time that the IRS's published data book presented compliance presence by activity code was in the FY 2019 data book. And so I wanted to be able to tie these distributions of exams closed and calendar year returns back to something that was sort of published. And so I'm using the numbers from the FY 2019 data book for those exams closed and returns filed. And then next the exams close, I have estimates of the exam time and the distribution of the exam costs. So exam time here would be direct examination time it takes to conduct those examinations. And examination cost is an estimate of the sort of hourly rate that would be applicable to the type of examination that was there. And so campus correspondence examinations are going to take generally less time. And the hourly rate that's applicable to those examinations is going to be less than, say, an examination conducted by a revenue agent. And so looking at 270 and 271, these are the EITC classes. They represent approximately 17.5% of calendar year 2018 returns, but roughly 44.5% of examinations closed. Now, the key factor is if you look at 270, most of those examinations are going to be campus correspondence examinations. And because they take significantly less time and they're much more, I'm gonna say, a limited scope and depth compared to a revenue agent field examination, I think there's sort of a false equivalency that's made when you start mixing together the different types of examinations in terms of looking at the number of closed exams. If you look at exam time, you'll see that 270 and 271 accounted for 17.8% of examination time. And so that is very comparable to the number of returns or the distribution of returns filed in the population. And the exam cost is even less of a share at 15% because those examinations generally are costing less per hour. But if you look at the share of the tax gap that is associated with those two classes, you'll see that the share of the tax gap is 28%. So the share of the tax gap that is accounted for by returns that claim the earned income tax credit is significantly more than the share of the resources in terms of time and cost that the IRS is allocating to those returns. Now, some of you, if you were to look at the published documentation that we have on the tax gap from tax year 2011 to 2013, might be familiar with the tax gap estimate for the EITC line item being $27 billion. And that $27 billion is roughly 9% of the $290 billion portion of the tax gap that I've been talking about. Yet the tax gap that's associated with 270, 271 returns that claim the ITC is 28%. And that's because returns that claim the ITC make other mistakes. For example, they may mistakenly claim the additional child tax credit. They may underreport their income and therefore underreport their tax. And so AITC is just one line item, one mistake that's made on those returns. The tax gap associated with the returns as a whole is significantly larger than the EITC as a line item by itself. The other one I'm going to look at is Activity Code 281. These are the taxpayers who reported $1 million or more of income. And key is they self-reported $1 million or more. I think I mentioned that earlier, but that is a very key distinction. So that's only 0.4% of tax returns, but it's 2.1% of examinations closed, yet it is nearly 14% of examination time and nearly 16% or over 15% of examination costs. And so in terms of our tax gap estimates, those returns are only accounting for 2.6% of our estimate. There's a couple of factors that could be going into that. Part of it is, as I mentioned, these are those who self-reported their income as being 281 and as being $1 million or more. And if you made more than $1 million in unreported income such that you reported less than $1 million, you don't show up in 281. And so some of the most egregious some of the most egregious non-compliance amongst high income taxpayers may not necessarily be showing up in the 281 class. Another potential factor is that there has been concerns raised recently that our estimates for undetected income may not necessarily be capturing all of the undetected income for high income taxpayers because of the nature and complexity of the returns and their income. And I talk about it a little bit later in the paper and a little bit later in the presentation. But we understand those concerns and are working to try to figure out how we can go about trying to address them through additional research. So the next slide basically shows the same information, except for instead of aligning it by activity class, it looks at the distribution by total positive income, reported total positive income. And it's using FY20 closures and tax year 18 returns because in FY20, the IRS sort of switched to this new presentation for compliance presence, but it tells a similar story, and so I'm going to sort of skip over that. This table shows the distribution of the tax gap if we were to array taxpayers by their reported total positive income versus if we array them by their true total positive or their estimated true total positive income, which in this table is labeled DC adjusted total positive income. And what I really want to show here is that if you look at taxpayers who report themselves as having lower income, they make up a much larger share of the tax gap than taxpayers who should have reported lower income. That's comparing, say, the second column to the fifth column. So taxpayers who self-reported between $1,000 and $25,000 accounted for 28% of the tax gap. But taxpayers who should have reported between $1,000 and $25,000 only accounted for 9% of the tax gap. And that's because taxpayers who underreport income are necessarily shifting down the income distribution. Likewise, if you were to look at high income taxpayers, taxpayers who self-report over $1 million of income are accounting for less than 3% of the tax gap. but taxpayers who should have reported over $1 million of total positive income account for nearly 8% of the tax gap. And it's the same story. Taxpayers are shifting themselves down the income ladder by reporting less income than they should. And my takeaway of this is that if you want a strategy that is focusing on the most egregious non-compliance amongst, say, high income, then you need to consider the fact that they may not be self-reporting themselves as high income, and you need to look and balance your strategy across all activity classes to try to get at that most egregious non-compliance. So this table shows the exact same information or similar information to the prior table, but in this situation, it's based upon just the examine and determine amount, but it tells the same story, and I just wanted to include it here sort of for full disclosure of the methodology, and so you can see that it tells a similar story. So one of my key points, well, the tax gap associated with taxpayers accruing DITC is significantly higher than the tax gap associated with the ITC line item. But really, what I really want to focus on is the fact that examination strategies, and I mentioned this, that focus exclusively on examining taxpayers based on their self-reported high income are likely to miss some of the most egregious non-compliance. And another factor is that more than half of the estimated individual income tax and self-employment tax underreporting tax gap is unlikely to be detected during an examination. So the tax gap estimates not necessarily reflect the amount of revenue that could be obtained through expanding examination coverage. Expanding examination coverage will definitely impact direct revenue. It will impact involuntary compliance. But the tax gap estimates are really not necessarily our best estimate of how much that's potential that could be. The IRS has other methodologies for estimating ROI, and around compliance initiatives are probably more appropriate for trying to get estimates of how much could be generated through a compliance initiative. Now, to be remiss to mention, or to not mention, that there are data limitations and concerns. These estimates are based on a sample, so they're clearly subject to sampling error. Detection controlled estimation is modeling, so it's subject to modeling error. And what most people are sort of focused on more recently, or I should say people are focused on more recently, is measurement error. And we try to address measurement error through the detection controlled estimation, yet there are still concerns remaining that our approach may not fully account for all undetected income, particularly for complex issues, or if we're projecting forward, it might not account for emerging issues. And so we're working on research to try to figure out in a strategy how to try to address that through additional data, potentially sort of adjusting our sample to collect more data in some areas. But also just want to keep in mind that looking at, say, emerging issues, there's a potential for substitution effects. Is there growth in non-compliance, or is this simply a change in the type so that the compliance rate itself has not really changed, but the source of the non-compliance itself has changed? And for issues that are of interest, are they additive or not? For example, is there overlap between the tax gap associated with international activities and illegal activities? Presumably there could be. Likewise, is there overlap between digital assets and illegal activities? Presumably there could be, and vice versa. So that's why we want to take sort of a bottoms up approach to actual compliance measurement, as opposed to sort of assuming what the compliance is through some kind of top down approach. We want a bottoms up compliance measurement program. And thank you. And I'm going to pass it off to Stephen Rosenthal for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew. Great presentation. And I liked all three papers, original and engaging. Let me share some comments with you in reverse order. I'll start with Drew's paper first, then Catherine's paper, and then Ryan's paper. So first, with Drew's paper, which focuses on the distribution of the individual tax gap for the years 2011 through 2013, the most recent NRP cycle. And distribution has been a hot issue. Do the top 1% cheat disproportionately? And for reasons that Drew touches upon, that's a tough question to answer. Drew also wants to use some of this distribution analysis to inform the allocation of enforcement resources. And that's an important question. How should the IRS use its limited resources? I think there's also going to be quite difficult to allocate resources based on income. But let me just start that earlier this year, I co-authored a paper with NYU professor Daniel Hemmel and TPC's senior fellow Janet Holtzblatt called "The Tax Gap's Many Shades of Gray." And I'm a tax lawyer by training, practiced for a couple decades and have been at the TPC for the last decade. And we tax lawyers think differently than tax economists. From our perspective, the tax gap is not black or white, it's shades of gray. In other words, the tax gap is not illegal versus legal or tax evasion versus avoidance. The tax gap in the tax law is ambiguous. And there's even some questions as to whether the IRS adjustments and determination of true tax is correct. So that informs a lot of the work and objectives that underlie what Drew's trying to achieve. So we tax lawyers think of the tax law as being a spectrum. You know, it could be a tax position could be frivolous, it could have substantial authority, it could be more likely than not to succeed if challenged, or it might will succeed if challenged. And that's really important to me, because this is not a binary decision when you think of the tax gap. Did the taxpayer put an illegal number down on a tax return or a legal number? And so Drew highlighted the importance of the detection controlled estimation technique, DCE, the statistical technique, to measure the tax gap. And it was a very important contribution to measure the tax gap because it, in effect, recognizes that the IRS cannot observe true income, but it can observe differences in recommended adjustments across examiners. And the DCE, the multiplier, is derived by trying to figure out how much the less effective examiners miss compared to the most successful tax examiners. The reason I describe that is the DCE is critical when we talk about the tax gap. It multiplies the size of the tax gap because there's a lot that the IRS believes that they're not finding on audit. And so when estimating the individual tax gap, I think Drew comes up with a number that the DCE multiplies the tax gap by 2 or maybe 3 times, at least 3 times according to some other researchers. That's big. And so when we think about the tax gap, we have to think about how to process the DCE. And the problem with processing the DCE is, does the DCE, is it based on the best IRS auditor or just the most aggressive? Because a whole bunch of IRS adjustments are reversed, either administratively or through appeals or later in litigation. And so is the issues that are being set up by the most successful auditors truly successful if they're ultimately reversed? Or is it just the most aggressive auditors? So that's a problem in thinking about the use of the DCE and the tax gap measurements. But there's a larger problem when we start talking about the DCE and you look at some of the tables that Drew presented to us. The DCE multiplier is inappropriate for distribution analysis. DeBacker and some other leading researchers have demonstrated. Because using the DCE multiplier for individual taxpayers effectively attributes undetected income to the same taxpayers with respect to detected unreported income. And so you get some bizarre results if you try to start ranking taxpayers by their DCE adjusted income. So it really is inappropriate. So Drew makes a lot of important contributions to the discussion of the tax gap and highlights the DCE, but there are very important limitations on the use of DCE, especially with respect to distribution. And I suspect Drew must realize some of that, because the ultimate goal of the paper, or the emphasis that Drew and his co-authors, actually Drew himself, no co-author on this paper, Drew is trying to answer is, how can the IRS best allocate examination resources by income distribution? And Drew told us, and he's right, you can't allocate based on reported high income because that misses taxpayers with low reported income, but high true income, the tax cheats. So that wouldn't be a good way to allocate resources by what taxpayers put on the returns. But the IRS can't observe true income. So it's inappropriate to allocate based on, or actually it's impossible to allocate based on true income because we don't know it. And using DCE adjusted income simply isn't appropriate. It won't work here. And so my takeaway from the paper basically is a very useful and comprehensive take on the tax gap, but it's unclear how the IRS can best allocate examination resources by income distribution, which is, I think, where Drew would like to go, but he doesn't draw any conclusions, in part because I think it's really difficult. And I agree with the comments that Alan Plumley made earlier. Seems to me that the IRS ought to allocate enforcement resources to line item categories, as opposed to trying to allocate resources to the top 1%, which has political attractions, but I think has methodological and practical limitations. But some items are more sensitive than other line items, like the EITC that Drew mentioned. And I think we have to be sensitive to, say, picking on low income, low resource taxpayers when we go after line items and allocate resources to line items. So let me shift next to Catherine's paper, Simulating Pre-Populated Form 1040s. And the top line from Catherine's report was that 41 to 48% of pre-populated returns could be labeled successful. And immediately this week, a commercial enterprise, Bass Enterprise, wrote a letter to the editor published in Tax Notes that there's no reason not to send pre-populated tax returns to 65 million taxpayers when you extrapolate 41, 48% to the taxpayer community. Let's just send them these 65 million taxpayers pre-populated returns. That'll help. But it's not as easy as this commercial enterprise suggests. Because I think a corollary to 41 to 48% success is that most pre-populated returns are unsuccessful. And having a pre-populated return that's unsuccessful raises a lot of problems in its own right, which I think is revealed by some of the tables that Catherine presents later. So what is success? Catherine already answered a question that was presented in the Q&A, that are filed tax returns truth, as Catherine assumed, or are these filed tax returns just tailored to match information available to the IRS through information returns? And so successful pre-populated returns may still be wrong. Catherine acknowledges that. She acknowledged that in the paper and in her answer to the Q&A. And I think it's correct, and I think unavoidable. But it's an interesting exercise that Catherine is undertaking, trying to figure out, like, how often can we expect the pre-populated return of being close? Now, mind you, when I say being close or success, how much is good enough for government? I mean, a lot of the philosophy of our tax filing systems is you put down the right number. You don't take a guess and estimate it. And so what does it mean if the IRS starts accepting returns because a category has a high likelihood of success, or success is measured in a way that a negligible amount of income might not be reported? Is that good enough for government? Maybe, but there are a lot of trade-offs in thinking about that. Now I want to address the 41 to 48%. Is that realistic? Is that the right number? Or is the number much lower, given the implementation challenges of pre-populating tax returns? Because as you know, it takes a lot of time for a tax return to be processed. Current law requires employers and third-party information providers to send out forms, typically by January 31, allow employees or the recipients to ask for a correction and clean the data before the information is sent on to the IRS, and then time for the IRS to reject the data and take corrections. Then, of course, we need time for the IRS to pre-populate a return and time for the taxpayer to review the pre-populated return. So Catherine and her co-authors harvested a lot of information returns for the year 2019, but they're acting years after the filing requirement, when the dust settles. I don't think we can wait for a couple of years for the IRS to pre-populate a return that can be used by taxpayers. So I'd like to see an estimate by these authors of what kind of realistic timeline could exist to allow that would allow the IRS to pre-populate a return to achieve the 41 to 48%. I mean, I'm sure Catherine is aware of this issue because her paper assumes that information reports are provided in a timely fashion. But I'd like to see a timeline to see whether 2019 returns might only be filed, say, in 2021, under some plausible set of assumptions on the processing of information returns. But more importantly, I think there's buried in Catherine's paper an observation that Fast Enterprise just omitted from their tax notes article. Because the observation Catherine and her co-authors made was that when pre-populated returns are wrong, that resulted in big tax errors. And then they went on, there's a table 2 in Catherine's paper that's very informative. And then Catherine and her co-authors went on to say, if taxpayers had paid the smaller of their actual reported tax liability or the pre-populated liability that Catherine and her co-authors calculated successfully and unsuccessfully, Catherine and her co-authors said income tax revenues would fall by 18%, doubling the current tax gap. So that's a problem. And there's a real trade-off behind helping taxpayers and helping the IRS. Now, implicit in some of the work that Catherine and her co-authors do is a recognition of that trade-off, that maybe we only pre-populate the simplest returns with high success rates, younger, lower income taxpayers. But the question I have is pre-populating the return really superior to other outreach attempts for these taxpayers? I'm not sure. So my takeaway from Catherine's paper is that pre-populated returns may help some taxpayers, but will increase the tax gap. Increasing the tax gap is a big problem. So lastly, let me discuss Ryan's paper. I mentioned I'm a tax lawyer, but 4 decades ago, I majored in mathematics at Berkeley. And I had to dust off a lot of thinking to read Ryan's paper. And as I understand machine learning, what Ryan and his co-authors are trying to do is to develop machine learning algorithms to predict whether the audit of a partnership will lead to an adjustment. The adjustment, that event, is what's known as a label. But when you think about machine learning, what you get turns a lot on your data set and your labels. And what if the adjustment is not a worthwhile goal? So I can tell you as a tax practitioner, from my couple decades of practice, sometimes IRS examiners are wrong. Sometimes they misunderstand the law. And I think in the partnership area, only about half the additional tax recommended by the examiners is actually assessed after supervisory and administrative reviews, and even less after litigation. And other times, the adjustment is ministerial, negligible. It's merely, say, a T&E adjustment, an adjustment to travel and entertainment deductions. So when I was in practice representing large taxpayers, partnerships, corporations, before the IRS, we would play whack-a-mole. We'd whack down every issue that seemed to have some threat to us and let other issues go forward that we could always settle out later. Or if the IRS wanted to settle based on a T&E adjustment and miss all the big issues, that was great. So what happens with machine learning when the partnership audit database is really poor, as IRS audits of partnerships are notoriously weak? Or suppose the database is obsolete, as partnership audits take many, many years to complete, and tax avoidance techniques evolve more rapidly. How would a machine learn from poor or obsolete data sets? Now, some of the features that Ryan wants to use to help the machines learn, he picked up from corporations and admits that that's not ideal. You prefer features from the partnership world. And there are, in fact, features from partnerships that are unique and informative to be on the positive side. It's important to think about the business of partnerships. Is it a law or accounting firm partnership? They have a lot of service income. Investment partnerships like hedge and private equity funds, they have a lot of capital gains and preference dividends. And neither one of these are particularly aggressive. These categories are particularly aggressive in terms of tax planning, in my experience. But other operating partnerships like real estate partnerships and oil and gas partnerships can be aggressive. And so you might want to think about that feature, Ryan. Also, the presence of taxable and tax-exempt partners, that may help uncover abusive partnership allocations, special allocations, or contributions and distributions between partners in the partnerships may uncover basis shifting transactions, another form of abuse. So my last observation is, Ryan is optimistic. He's going to start with regression and random forest analysis. That's all explainable, transparent to some extent. We can tell why the machine algorithm is actually recommending a partnership for audit, because it has, say, a higher proportion of tax-exempt partners, say. But Ryan wants to go on to deep neural networks next. And deep neural networks are not explainable. They're a mystery. We give a data set to the computer, we ask the computer to spit out, the machine to spit out a model. We can't explain the algorithm. The machine learned on its own. I think it may be important to have explainable models, because what happens if the algorithm selects partnerships to audit based on factors like race or age of the partners, or whether the partnerships operated in red or blue states geographically, or other categories that are ethically, legally, or politically suspect? That's a problem. And I think we have to be able to answer that problem and correct the algorithm as needed. So in sum, my takeaway is machines are going to struggle to learn partnerships just like the rest of us struggle. So those are my comments on the three papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We'll turn now to the Q&A period. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. First, I'd like to give the presenters an opportunity to respond to the discussants' comments. Ryan, you're up first.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. Steve, I really appreciate your discussion and your comments. I want to address some comments that Steve Rosenthal had, and then also some of the questions that are in the Q&A from Steve Uki that kind of mirror those comments. So I want to address them in buckets so I don't have to go one by one. The first comment is about the labels, audits of partnerships. It's absolutely true that the audits of partnerships are sparse. We can see that in the IRS data books that only about 0.4% of partnerships undergo audits. We would love in this space if there were an NRP of partnerships, if there were just random partnerships and every single partnership were audited. That's not the world that we're living in. But what we are working under the assumption in the paper is that among those partnerships that are audited, if there is a audit adjustment, and we're looking at audit adjustments before it's appealed and before litigation, that is a better indication that there is some tax planning or aggressive tax planning going on. We are looking at expanding the labels that we use, including whether there was an audit initialized in the first place, and then maybe even creating some soft labels that aren't from the IRS, but just that we develop from the data. So we look forward to expanding these labels in the future, but we're working with what we have. The second bucket of comments, I think, falls into the features that we use in our model. And both in the Q&A and the discussion, there are a number of features that were suggested. And I think we agree with each of these in expanding the feature list. At the end of the presentation, I mentioned that we want to expand these features. Creating these features is a non-trivial task, and we're just working to expand them. Some of these features include common ownership. For example, if there's an owner that owns multiple different partnerships and one of those partnerships is found to be tax non-compliant, how does that translate into other partnership structures? Things like the owner type, what the allocation, where the IRS is making the adjustment on the partnership return, whether it's on the business side or whether it's on the allocation side. So there in the Q&A there, and in Steve's discussion, there were a lot of different features that we can include. Yes, we appreciate those suggestions and we're looking to include them. And then related to the last point in the discussion on the interpretability of deep neural networks, yes, this is something that we are aware of, that once you get into these DNNs, the interpretability decreases. And one of the important things is we want to make sure that these audits are not being conducted, as Steve mentioned, on things like race or age. So I think it's going to be an empirical question of how well these DNNs do in identifying tax non-compliance. Are they 5% better? Are they 100% better? It'll be interesting to see where the trade-offs between interpretability and accuracy land. And and then the final thing, the final bucket in the Q&A relates to how we're segmenting the data, which groups of partnerships we're looking at. And this is something that we're pursuing currently, is how to break up the data, whether we're looking at operating partnerships or investment partnerships, income stratifications, just separating out these partnership structures based on what they do, what industry they're doing, also something that we are pursuing. So we appreciate the comments related to the segmentation.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Catherine, do you have any responses?
Sure. Thank you so much for the detailed comments, Steve. I guess I would just say in terms of the timeline, we did not try to say like how this would actually be implemented. I don't know that that's something that our group has enough expertise to say like this is exactly how the IRS should do this. There are obviously, as Steve mentioned, and as we mentioned in my presentation, a ton of implementation issues. And we acknowledge that it wouldn't be perfect, but I think that we still think it's an interesting thing to consider, because I don't think the status quo, this is my personal opinion, is perfect either. Like spending lots of money with private tax preparers who are getting, getting profits from having such a complicated tax system that people don't understand. And so maybe this goes to some of the questions in the Q&A. Could the IRS do something small scale? Could they have an opt-in experience? There was an experience in California that was pretty limited, I believe, and came up to some pretty big resistance from lobbyists. But the general sense was it was well received among the small, narrow group of taxpayers that it was applied to. So I think there's some potential there. I totally understand the IRS has a lot of constraints, and I definitely wouldn't advocate for doing something not well. Like if the coming up with the detailed plan of how to implement it suggests that it's not going to be implemented well, then I don't think it's a good policy to pursue. I did want to say something about the 18% estimate, which we've thought a bit more about that. So that was the large increase in the tax gap that would happen if all individuals who had underestimated liability relative to what they were reporting before just accepted the return. Those with overestimated liability always fix it to be lower. I think that is a very extreme assumption, especially now that I've read the experimental literature a little bit more and seen some stuff on Finland's experience when they implemented pre-populated returns. I do think there will be asymmetric, perhaps, adjustments, but it is unlikely to be, I think, that extreme. If we do look at if everyone just accepted the pre-populated return, I think tax receipts among filers would decrease by around 1%. So we're close to the tax liability in what we send out. But yes, there are definitely large revenue effects that could, and compliance effects that could come from pre-populated returns. I want to see if there's anything. I think those were the only things I wanted to say to Steve. I know there were some other questions in the chat, but I can reply to those or discuss them later. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Drew, do you have any responses?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate your comments. I think the one that I really want to touch on is the appropriateness of detection controlled estimation for doing the distributional analysis. Back in tax year 2001, when we estimated the tax gap for tax year 2001, we were using a detection controlled estimation approach that was a multiplier approach. And the problem with the multiplier approach for distributional analysis is you can really only multiply something that's positive. And so if the examiner detected something, some positive amount, then you can apply that multiplier and get it, but it sort of concentrates all of those adjustments. Since then, especially more recently, we've been using micro level estimates of undetected income, and we're not using a multiplier approach. And so coming out of the detection controlled estimation, we get an estimate of the probability of undetected income, and conditional on there being undetected income, an estimate of the amount. And we actually go through a simulation process where we do a random draw from the probability distribution to determine who to allocate undetected income to. And we do this 10 times and sort of average it. But that all effectively is doing is just giving us a much more realistic allocation of that undetected income, such that we're not allocating a little bit to everybody. We're not allocating all of it to some. And so it reflects the estimated underlying distribution of the undetected income itself. And so I think for that standpoint, where we are now and the improvements that we made, I think it is providing that realistic distribution as opposed to sort of where we were before with the multiplier approach. So appreciate that. The other, I did see one question. Let me see if I can find her real quick that I think is probably addressed to me. 1 second, please. From Mike Goodell asked, do the closed exams for audit class 270 and 271 include exams where the IRS could not locate the taxpayer at all? My understanding is for operational high risk examinations or operational risk-based examinations, that those would be included in that. So if you were looking at the exams closed the column in the tables, that would include taxpayers who could not be located if that ended up resulting in a statutory notice. For the underlying data for tax gap estimation, the National Research Program, generally, we were not going to be including situations in which the taxpayer cannot be located. And so in that situation, it's not going to be reflective in our underlying estimates. So,
Thank you, Drew. We'll now turn to other questions from the audience. Again, I encourage anyone who has questions to enter them in the Q&A box. Let's see, the first question is for Catherine, I think. Has the IRS ever field tested IRS prepared pre-populated income tax returns? Anything that can be shared about that experience if it happened?
So it's possible. I'm sure there's many people on this conference that know more about that than me. But there is a program, I think, that was kind of suspended but brought back in 2019 for those who were non-filers who were estimated to owe large amounts of liability. So it's the ASFR program. I don't know a lot about it. I'm sure it's not the most popular program, given that it's pre-populating a return, telling people they owe tax returns or tax liability for people who haven't filed. But it is an instance in which the IRS has tried to use the information they have to pre-populate a return. And then the other experience, I would say, there are other countries that do this. They have simpler tax systems, so it's a little hard to draw on their experiences 100% for the US. And as I mentioned, California did this for like a narrow subset of individuals for a number of years. And generally, there was positive feedback on that experiment.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is for Drew. Do you expect the 2 new activity codes introduced for filing year 2022 to have any particular impact on tax gap research?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for some background, when I showed the activity codes, they sort of stopped at activity code 281, which is taxpayers who reported total positive income of $1 million or more. And I had some footnotes in there. I don't know what the typo looked like, acknowledging that beginning and processing year, I think it was 22. The IRS was splitting out activity code 281 into 3 new activity codes, 282, 283, and 284. And 282 would capture taxpayers who self-reported total positive income between $1 million and $5 million, and then 283 would be 5 to 10, and 284 would be $10 million and above. And historically, our NRP studies and sample design have sort of focused on those activity codes as a starting place for a variety of reasons, but partly because since they're used for examination planning, it's useful to design it that way, but also because we have used the data not only for tax gap estimation and compliance estimation, but also for developing workload selection formulas. It serves a variety of purposes. And so with the introduction of the new activity classes, that prompted us to realize that our sample size was relatively small in, say, 283 and 284, simply because it's a tiny fraction percentage-wise of the population return filed. It's in the 20 to 30,000 return size, right? I mean, per year. And so looking forward, we're realizing we need to adjust our sample to collect more data in those classes going forward, so that we can better inform both tax gap estimation and other compliance analyses and risk modeling that we would be doing. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Ryan. Are you planning on experimenting with graph neural network models in addition to standard deep neural networks?
Yeah, so that's our plan, and I would love to dive into it more. But as I mentioned at the beginning of our paper, we have our team where we have our computer science machine learning specialists. So this is something that Emily and Mansij know a lot more about. But yes, that's something that we have discussed.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Catherine. Comment followed by a question. California had a successful pre-filed return program, Ready Returns, some years ago. The program was limited to a small fraction of the taxpayer population to avoid problems considered in today's presentation with incomplete third-party information. Although limited, however, it was well received by participants. Might such a program be feasible at the federal level?
I think that would be our hope, and that's part of what motivated that table that you saw that I kind of walked through slowly, like looking at different subsets in case it was easier to start with a similar subset to what California did. I mean, they did discontinue it, so I guess that tells you for whatever political or other reasons. I don't know if that might limit the feasibility, but I do think it's a good example of, in the US context at least, of this being used.
Thank you. And one more question for Catherine. Does the paper account for non-compliance in the returns that were filed? If the comparison is between the simulated return versus the return as filed, it seems that some may be classified as matches or non-matches if we assume that the returns as filed were all accurate.
So no, we don't. So we take this stance in the paper partially for practicality reasons, that we look at what the taxpayer filed and try to make the pre-populated return match that. I mean, ideally, we would have some sort of true distribution. I mean, that's what a lot of the conference has been about, right? Like, do we know what the truth is? And then we could compare how a pre-populated return versus what people are filing under the current status quo compares to that truth. So to that point, there's some of our errors, some of our successes are not successes to that truth. And then some of our errors, like if we overestimate tax liability for individuals relative to what they filed, that might actually be sort of the true correct amount. But we would consider that a failure. It's a hard question to take a stance on what the absolute truth is, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we've had a chance to get to most or all of the questions that have been asked in the chat. So I'd like to thank our session 2 presenters and the discussant for a great session, as well as the audience. We are taking a short break and we'll resume at 12:40 Eastern Time for our keynote. John M. Aboud, Associate Director and Chief Scientist, Research and Methodology, Directorate, U.S. Census Bureau.